Hey there, sleepless rabble. You're probably lying there, eyes wide open, wondering why your brain decided to stage a late night philosophy class. Don't worry, let me take over for a while. Tonight, I'll take you somewhere old. Very old. So old, in fact, that the world hadn't even figured out what a world was supposed to be. No stars, no sun, no sassy gods with lightning bolts and jealousy issues. Just chaos and a lot of awkward silence. We're diving into Greek mythology, but not the Hollywood remix. This is the raw, ancient, beautifully messy version, where gods are petty, love is a battlefield, and mortals are basically background noise. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and if this myth soaked madness makes you smile, consider tossing us a tip at Ko-fi.com. It helps fuel the long hours it takes to craft these stories and keeps the ambrosia flowing so we don't fall asleep before you do. Now tell me, if you could ask one question to any Greek god, what would it be? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to boring Greek mythology for sleep. From chaos to Olympus and all the divine nonsense in between, let's begin. All right, close your eyes, drift back into the silence behind all things, and let's begin. Chapter 1: Chaos, Night, and the Beautiful Absence of Meaning. In the beginning, there was chaos. Not the kind you find in your inbox on a Monday morning. Not even the emotional chaos of dating a Gemini. Number. This was primordial chaos. A yawning, endless humming emptiness. Not dark, because darkness implies the absence of light. And light hadn't even been invented yet. This was the absence of everything, including the idea of absence. A place where place didn't exist, and time wasn't even late. There were no gods, no stars, no mountains, no oceans, just chaos. And yet, from this vast and silent non-thing came something. Because apparently, even the void gets bored. First to emerge was Gaia, Earth herself. Not like the spinning blue ball you see from space, but a sentient force. Solid, fertile, ancient, the ultimate matriarch. She didn't need to be born, she just was. From her vast body would later rise forests, rivers, and the stubborn idea of home. But for now, she floated alone, cradling silence. Next came Tartarus, the deep abyss. Imagine the worst basement you've ever seen. Now stretch it beneath all reality and add some existential dread. That's Tartarus, a place so far below, even the darkness avoids it. Then came Eros, not the cute, chubby-winged cherub from Valentine's Day. No. This Eros was a cosmic force, passion, attraction, the glue that makes atoms dance and stars ignite. Without Eros, nothing would touch. Nothing would combine. He was the reason chaos didn't just stay alone forever, brooding in its black hoodie. Nyx arrived soon after, night in her purest form, regal, veiled, and absolute. She brought with her a strange peace, the kind that makes you forget what fear is. Her children would be some of the darkest forces the cosmos would ever know. Sleep, death, doom, but that came later. For now, she drifted silently across the emptiness, a lullaby no one had yet learned to hear. And still, nothing really happened. They existed, yes, but there were no dramas, no thunderous declarations, no affairs between uncles and nieces, yet. Just potential, waiting. Then Gaia, being the only one with a hint of creative flair, decided to make a partner. She birthed Uranus, the sky. Tall, expansive, glittering with the promise of stars not yet born. He covered her like a cloak. And in that cosmic embrace, something extraordinary began to stir. Their union sparked creation. The Titans, massive and powerful, destined to challenge the heavens. Then came the Cyclopes, one-eyed smiths with a gift for building dangerous things. And finally, the Hecatonchires, creatures with 100 arms and 50 heads, because why not? The universe was still figuring out its design language. But Uranus, terrified by the monstrous beauty of his children, did what all insecure new fathers seem to do in mythology. He shoved them back where they came from, into Gaia's womb, which, to be clear, was the entire Earth. Imagine the discomfort. Gaia groaned. Not metaphorically. She literally groaned with the weight of her children trapped inside her. The Earth ached. The stars held their breath. And just like that, the seeds of revolution were planted. One of those buried children, the youngest Titan, Cronus, would rise up with a sickle made from unbreakable stone. And when the time came, he'd use it. The sky would bleed. The stars would blink. And the rule of the Titans would begin. But that's a tale for the next time you can't sleep. Because as Gaia sharpens her resolve and chaos watches quietly from the edges of existence, the story of power, betrayal, and dysfunctional divine parenting is just beginning. Chapter 2. The sky falls quietly. Gaia had had enough. Carrying the weight of rebellious children stuffed deep inside her body was not her idea of motherhood. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't divine. It was uncomfortable and humiliating. Uranus, once her shimmering consort, had become something else entirely. Cold, distant, afraid of his own offspring. So he hid them away, locked in the folds of her vast form, hoping silence would make them disappear. But Gaia did not forget, nor did she forgive. In the soft, slow churn of timelessness, she crafted a plan. Quietly, patiently. No thunder, no drama, just inevitability. She shaped a great sickle from grey stone, the kind of tool meant not for pruning vines, but for cutting through the very order of things. And she waited. She whispered. She reached out to her buried sons, one by one. Most were too afraid. Who would dare rise against the sky itself? But Cronus. Cronus was different. He wasn't the biggest, not the strongest, but there was something sharp in him. Something cold and clever and hungry. He took the sickle, and he waited, just as his mother told him. One night, if it could be called that, Uranus descended to Gaia as he always did, draping himself across her like a heavy shroud. And from within her, Cronus struck. The sickle flashed once, a clean, irreversible cut. The sky recoiled, stars scattered, and time itself seemed to pause, stunned. Uranus fled upward, wounded and furious, never to return to Gaia's embrace. From the blood that fell upon the earth, strange beings were born. Giants, furies, and other restless spirits who would wander the edges of myth forever. Cronus stood alone in the quiet that followed, victorious, unchallenged, the new ruler of everything. He freed his siblings from Gaia's depths, bringing light and motion to a world that had known only stasis. The Titans emerged into a world still forming, rough and raw, but full of promise. They shaped rivers, lifted mountains, called stars into being. They carved the world into something almost comprehensible. For a while, all was well. But Gaia, wise as ever, knew what the future held. Power once tasted does not make men or gods gentle, and Cronus, for all his cool precision and charm, was no exception. He ruled with calculation, not compassion. He feared the chaos he had come from. He feared loss. He feared being replaced. And so, when a quiet prophecy reached his ears that one of his own children would rise against him, he didn't hesitate. He did exactly what his father had done before him, just with better follow-through. He swallowed them, one by one as they were born. No hesitation, no regret. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, gulp. Each child disappeared into the darkness of his stomach. Safe, he thought. Contained. The future devoured. But destiny doesn't like being cheated. And Gaia was still watching. This time, it would be Rhea, Cronus' sister, queen, and quiet co-conspirator, who would make sure the cycle didn't repeat forever. Somewhere, hidden on an island where goats screamed and nymphs danced, a baby was crying. Not yet a god, not yet a king, just a single voice echoing softly in the vastness. Zeus, and with him, the storm began to gather. Chapter 3: Goats, Thunder, and the Birth of Rebellion. The island was wild. Cretan winds swept over jagged cliffs and twisted olive trees, where the cries of seabirds blurred with something stranger, something louder. The locals said it was just goats, just the howling of the sacred herd echoing through the caves. But they were wrong. Inside a hidden cavern, deep and dark and dripping with the breath of the earth, a baby cried. Not just any baby, one who had been smuggled away from the edge of oblivion, hidden by a desperate mother and shielded by fate itself. His name was Zeus. Rhea had reached her breaking point. After watching 5 of her newborns disappear into the hungry silence of Cronus' stomach, she did what desperate mothers do. She lied. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and handed it to her husband with a steady smile. He devoured it, of course, without question. That was the kind of parent he'd become. Meanwhile, the real child was whisked away to a cave on Mount Ida. There, in the company of screaming goats and militant nymphs, the future king of gods was raised far from the shadow of the Titan throne. His wet nurse was a divine goat named Amalthea, whose milk gave him strength, whose horn, torn accidentally from her head, would later become the cornucopia, spilling endless bounty. The Curetes, bronze-clad warriors loyal to Rhea, danced around the cave entrance, clashing their shields and swords to drown out his infant wails. Not out of celebration, out of sheer survival. The noise was camouflage, a lullaby of violence to protect a god still in diapers. Time passed strangely in those early days. Zeus grew, as divine children do, too fast and too wise. He listened, he watched, he learned not just the world, but the fears that shaped it. He saw how power made fathers cruel, how silence made mothers complicit, and how nothing, not even the sky, stayed unchallenged forever. When the time came, he left the cave, not as a child, but as a storm in waiting. His first move was not war, it was cunning, disguise, infiltration. He served Cronus in secret, moving in the corridors of power as just another attendant, a quiet shadow. But even in disguise, his presence was like a crack forming in stone, a hairline fracture in the illusion of Titan invincibility. Eventually, with the help of Metis, a clever oceanid who understood the language of transformation, Zeus tricked his father into drinking a potion. Not poisoned, just purging. One by one, the swallowed gods returned, whole, furious, divine. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Released like secrets, long buried, they gasped and blinked at the world their brother had grown into. And they chose him. Not because he was the strongest, not because he asked, but because he acted. Together, they rose against the Titans. The war that followed was not quick, not clean. It shattered the earth and split the skies. Mountains crumbled, oceans boiled, even chaos stirred, uneasy. This was the Titanomachy, 10 years of lightning, blood, and stone. And in the end, it was not brute force that won, but alliance. Zeus freed the Cyclopes from the deep prison of Tartarus, where Cronus had hidden them. In gratitude, they gave him thunder, gave Poseidon the trident, gave Hades the helmet of invisibility. The world changed, forever. Cronus fell, like his father before him, not slain, but cast into the same prison he had once ruled with fear. The Titans were broken, scattered, buried deep beneath the world they had shaped. And above it all, a new order was declared. Zeus, lord of the sky. Poseidon, ruler of the sea. Hades, sovereign of the underworld. The age of the Olympians had begun. But peace among gods is a fragile, flickering thing, and not even Olympus would be free from thunder. Chapter 4. Dividing the spoils and assembling the dysfunction. Victory has its own kind of silence. After the storm of war, after the Titans were buried and the skies stopped burning, the world exhaled. For the first time in an age, there was no shouting, no sickles, no collapsing heavens. Just three brothers, standing at the edge of a new era, staring out over a battered but living world, and wondering what the hell to do next. They had won. But what did that mean? Zeus, with lightning still humming in his fingertips, proposed order, balance, a division not based on age or blood, but on domain. The cosmos, once ruled by a single paranoid king, would now be split into three. They drew lots, because of course they did. Divine power, determined by a cosmic lottery. Mythology has never been particularly romantic about fairness. Zeus drew the sky. It suited him, vast, commanding, unpredictable. Poseidon claimed the sea, deep, moody, and full of things that bite. Hades was left with the underworld, a realm of shadows and silence. Some say he got the short straw, others say he was relieved. No court politics, no golden thrones, just quiet, death, and a job that no one else wanted. The earth itself, Gaia's body, remained neutral ground, shared territory, a kind of true space. Not that the gods respected it for long. With the realms divided, the newly minted Olympians climbed the mountain that would become their throne, Mount Olympus. A place not just of altitude, but attitude. There were no mortals there yet. No altars or hymns or temple columns. Just wind and stone, and a growing sense of self-importance. The gods arrived not as symbols of balance and wisdom, but as squabbling immortals with boundary issues and personal agendas. First came Hera, sister and wife to Zeus, which already tells you everything you need to know about how the family tree was pruned. She walked with pride, carried storms in her silence, and marked her territory with disdain. She was not here for your affection. She was here for her crown. Then came Demeter, warm, watchful, always slightly apart. She brought the promise of harvests, of rebirth. But under that calm exterior was the memory of betrayal, and it would bloom eventually into winter. Hestia arrived with no noise at all. She lit the first hearth on Olympus and sat beside it, content. She asked for nothing, claimed nothing, just kept the fire burning. Poseidon roared up the mountain, trident in hand, with sea spray still dripping from his beard. Restless already, never quite comfortable so far from the soul and pull of tides. Hades did not join them. He returned to his realm beneath the earth, content with shadows and spirits. Olympus was never his kind of party. And Zeus? Zeus sat at the summit, lightning curling lazily in his palm, and smiled. He had climbed from infancy in a cave to a throne above the clouds, and he knew something no one else dared say aloud. Peace doesn't last. Not with gods like these. Not with brothers who draw lots for power, or wives who never forget. Not with immortals who love mortals, and mortals who die from it. Olympus was a kingdom born from rebellion, but it would become famous for something far more dangerous: its domestic life. Chapter 5: Divine Entanglements and Heavenly Soap Operas. Mount Olympus had barely cooled beneath their feet before the gods began doing what gods do best. They started sleeping with each other, and then yelling about it. It didn't take long for Olympus to stop being a throne room and start resembling a poorly managed villa full of immortal narcissists with boundary issues. And at the center of it all sat Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of the sky, husband to Hera, and utterly incapable of keeping his tunic on. Let's not pretend he tried. Zeus had a wandering eye and a talent for creative shapeshifting. He seduced mortals, nymphs, and even other immortals in forms ranging from golden rain, to swans, to actual bulls. Not metaphorical bulls. Literal, horned, mooing bulls. The man was committed to the bit. Each affair left behind a myth, a mess, and often a child. Dozens of them. Half-gods, heroes, monsters. He seeded the world like a divine storm, and Hera, goddess of marriage, watched from the high seat of Olympus, lips pressed thin, fury rising with every whispered rumor. She was not the type to shout. She was the type to wait. Hera didn't lash out at Zeus. She went after his lovers, and their children. Leto, Io, Semele, Alcmene, mortal women who had the misfortune of catching Zeus's interest. They paid for it in madness, exile, fire. Hera's wrath was focused, precise, and devastating. Heracles, perhaps the most famous bastard of them all, would spend his life proving himself to a stepmother who would never forgive his birth. And yet, Hera wasn't just jealous. She was tired. Tired of betrayal dressed as power, of fidelity being treated as a joke. Still, she stayed. Maybe out of pride, maybe out of position, or maybe because Olympus was never a place you left. It was a place you endured. Meanwhile, other gods were entangling themselves in dramas of their own. Ares, the god of war, had an ongoing affair with Aphrodite, goddess of love and marital inconvenience. The problem? Aphrodite was technically married to Hephaestus, the lame god of fire and forge, who had been given a hand like a consolation prize. He wasn't amused. When he found out, he didn't yell. He built a net, a delicate, invisible, unbreakable trap of divine bronze, placed over his marriage bed. One night, as Ares and Aphrodite rolled into each other's arms, the net snapped shut, locking them together in a most compromising position. Hephaestus summoned the gods, all of them, and there they stood, gathered around the tangled lovers, laughing, pointing. Zeus chuckled. Hermes made bets. Poseidon just nodded with solemn appreciation. It was grotesque, and exactly on brand. Because while mortals prayed to Olympus for wisdom, love, and justice, the gods were playing out a reality show in the clouds, full of lust, revenge, ego, and unspoken trauma. And yet, for all their flaws, they were mirrors. Each god reflected something raw and human: desire, wrath, loyalty, vanity. They were never meant to be role models. They were meant to explain us to ourselves. But before their dramas could echo down to earth, before temples and statues and poetry, there was still a pantheon to complete. A new kind of goddess was about to arrive. One born not from union or passion, but from thought. A daughter of wisdom, fully armed and entirely sick of this nonsense. Chapter 6: Headaches, Wisdom, and the Girl Who Needed No Mother. There's a certain kind of pain that no thunderbolt can fix, even for Zeus. It started as a pressure, a tight, echoing throb behind his temples. Not the kind you get from hangovers or Hera's silent treatment, but something deeper, something ancient and alive. A swelling tension that pulsed behind his eyes, sharper with every breath. The king of gods tried to ignore it, tried pacing Olympus, tried hurling a few lightning bolts into the horizon, just to let off steam. But the pain only grew, unbearable, unrelenting. Finally, in an act of divine desperation, he called for help. Enter Hephaestus, god of fire, forge, and unexpectedly cooperative neurosurgery. When Zeus asked him to crack open his skull, the god of craftsmen didn't even flinch. He simply took up his hammer and split open the Sky King's forehead with the precision of a master smith. Out of the wound stepped a goddess, fully grown, clad in armor, shield in one hand, spear in the other. No blood, no tears, just the unmistakable sound of sandals hitting marble as she landed. Her name was Athena. She was born without a mother, conceived in Zeus's mind, and gestated in his body after he'd swallowed Metis, goddess of wisdom, years earlier, trying to outmaneuver fate. There had been a prophecy, of course. There's always a prophecy. Metis was to bear a child greater than her father. So Zeus, in classic insecure fashion, had swallowed her whole. He'd hoped that would be the end of it. But wisdom, it turns out, cannot be digested. It just grows quieter, sharper, and eventually, it finds a way out. Athena's emergence was not met with horror. She was calm, cool, radiating clarity, no divine tantrums, no ego, just presence. Even Hera paused, watching the new goddess with something close to reluctant admiration. Athena quickly took her place among the Olympians. Not as a daughter, not as a decoration, but as an equal. A warrior without bloodlust. A strategist without cruelty. The goddess of wisdom, but also of war, law, and civilization. Cities would rise in her name. Athens would be hers, after a little contest involving an olive tree and some salt water. But that's for later. What mattered now was this. She was different. While the other gods stumbled through emotion and impulse, Athena moved with purpose. She didn't fall in love, didn't chase, didn't lash out. She watched. She chose. She calculated. She was proof that the divine could be powerful without being chaotic. And the mortals would come to love her for it. Of course, the rest of Olympus remained blissfully messy. Aphrodite still sparked wars with a smile. Ares still picked fights he couldn't win. Dionysus hadn't even arrived yet, and already the concept of restraint was unraveling. But Athena was a new kind of deity, one that whispered of cities not yet built, of laws not yet written, of futures more complex than the whims of immortals. Her birth changed something. Because if wisdom could walk, talk, and wear a helmet, maybe the world wasn't just a playground for divine dysfunction after all. And somewhere, deep in the underworld, a shadow stirred. Hades had heard the clatter of Olympus grow louder. The hierarchy was shifting. Mortals were multiplying. And soon, someone would have to deal with what came after. Because no matter how golden the age, nothing lives forever. Chapter 7: Death, Shadows, and the Reluctant King Below. Far beneath the gleaming drama of Olympus, deeper than any well could reach and darker than the sea's forgotten trenches, there was a door. It wasn't guarded by their marble statues or fire-breathing beasts, just silence. The kind of silence that presses against your chest and whispers truths you'd rather not hear. Behind that door was the realm of the dead, and at the center of it all sat Hades, not with a crown, not with ceremony, just presence. He hadn't asked for this kingdom. He hadn't schemed or drawn a blade for it. The underworld was what he got when the cosmos was divided like spoils after a long, exhausting war. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon, the sea, and Hades. Hades got everything that came after. Souls, endings, the weight of memory. He ruled without cruelty, without vanity. There were no orgies, no thunderous declarations, just the steady rhythm of arrivals, every soul making their way across the river Styx, clutching a coin, or nothing at all. Charon ferried them, gaunt, tireless, indifferent. Kerberos, the three-headed hound, guarded the gates, snarling at intruders, but gently sniffing the newly dead. The realm itself wasn't all fire and screams. That was a later invention, courtesy of monotheism and poor translations. No, the Greek underworld was layered, complex. It had fields of asphodel, where average souls wandered in forgetful neutrality, the Elysian fields, where heroes rested in endless peace, and Tartarus, the deep pit reserved for cosmic traitors and those who made the gods uncomfortable. Hades ruled it all. He rarely left, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. Olympus was too loud, too volatile, and besides, he had a kingdom that needed his attention. A realm that never slept, never ceased, never stopped reminding him of how small even the greatest gods could become. But even Hades, composed as he was, found himself lonely. Not in the dramatic, tortured poet sense, more like a slow ache, an awareness of absence. He had a realm, but no companion, no reflection, no balance. That would change. Not today, not yet. But soon a young goddess would gather flowers above ground. The world would hold its breath. A scream would split the air. And love, strange, cold, and defiant, would bloom in the dark. For now, though, Hades sat on his throne of quiet stone. He watched the souls drift past, each one a whisper, each one a thread in the vast, fraying tapestry of fate. And above him, far beyond the rock and shadow, the gods continued their tangled dance, unaware that even immortality casts a long, inescapable shadow. Chapter 8. Flowers, Abduction, and the Making of a Season. The day it happened was warm. Somewhere in the mortal world, fields yawned under a generous sun. Crops stretched lazily toward the sky. Bees whispered through meadows thick with promise. And Persephone, daughter of Demeter, laughed among the flowers. She wasn't a goddess of death then. Not yet. She was spring incarnate, light-footed, curious, radiating the kind of beauty that made the world lean in a little closer. Wherever she walked, things grew. Trees sighed. Birds forgot their songs. Time softened its step. But she was watched. Hades had seen her once, just once, emerging from the haze of sunlight like something he'd forgotten to believe in. Not a wraith, not a queen, just life, blooming without apology. And something shifted. Love, desire, possession. It's hard to say what name fit best. What is clear is this. Hades wanted her. Not as a conquest, not as a hostage, but as something more complicated. A presence in the quiet. A voice beside his own. He did not ask. No proposals, no flowers, no divine matchmaking. The earth cracked open beneath Persephone's feet. The flowers she was picking scattered into the wind, and in a blink, she was gone. Taken. Demeter felt it instantly. She didn't hear the scream, but she felt the absence, like a snapped string inside her chest. Her daughter was missing, and no one, not even the gods, would tell her where she'd gone. So she searched, through valleys, across oceans, into the cold corners of Olympus where the gods played dumb. Demeter, once the gentle bringer of grain and comfort, became a storm. Fields withered under her grief. Trees shed their leaves in sympathy. Crops refused to grow. The world began to die. Zeus, uncomfortable and increasingly hungry, eventually admitted the truth. He had known. He had allowed it. After all, Hades was his brother. Persephone was of age. It was practical. Demeter was not impressed. She demanded her daughter back, whole and untainted. Zeus agreed reluctantly, and sent Hermes, the divine messenger, the only god fast enough to pass between realms, with orders to retrieve the girl. But Persephone had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds. Not much, just a taste. But in the language of the underworld, that was enough. To eat the food of the dead is to belong, to stay. A compromise was struck. For 6 months of the year, Persephone would rise, returning to her mother, bringing with her the bloom of spring and the golden generosity of summer. But for the other 6, she would descend once more. Queen of the dead, wife of Hades, silent sovereign of the shadows. And so the seasons were born, not from weather or science, but from grief and compromise, from a mother's mourning and a daughter's duality, life and death, light and dark, stitched together in an endless rhythm. Persephone was no longer just a girl in a field. She was now the line between worlds, the promise that even in death, something beautiful still waits. Chapter 9. Foam, jealousy, and a goddess with absolutely no chill. Long before beauty tutorials and impossible beauty standards, the sea gave birth to a woman who would make both completely irrelevant. One morning, if you could call it that, off the coast of Cyprus, the waves began to churn. Not from storms or ships, but from something older, stranger. You see, back when Cronus staged his bloody little family coup, he flung Uranus's severed bits into the ocean. Yes, those bits. The divine leftovers. The sea, never one to waste anything magical or mildly inappropriate, responded by foaming. A lot. And from that frothy mess rose a figure that would go on to cause more trouble than all the thunderbolts in the sky. Aphrodite, fully formed, naked, smirking, floating toward shore on a seashell like she was late for a fashion shoot. She didn't walk. She arrived. Like a perfume ad. Like a scandal waiting to happen. The gods stared. Mortals would later write songs, build temples, and ruin their lives for her. But the Olympians, they panicked. Because Aphrodite wasn't just beautiful, she was beauty, weaponized. And that kind of power tends to unbalance even the most overconfident pantheon. Zeus, sensing the impending chaos, did what every insecure male deity seems to do when faced with a woman he couldn't control. He married her off. Not to Oris, the obvious choice. Number that would have made sense? He gave her to Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship, brilliant but physically twisted, and generally considered the least sexy immortal on the mountain. A political move, they said, a symbolic match, beauty and craft, flame and form, blah blah, mythic poetry. Aphrodite was not amused. She accepted the arrangement with a raised eyebrow and a private vow to do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, with whoever she wanted. Which, as it turned out, included Ares, the god of war, violence, and deeply questionable emotional intelligence. Their affair became the worst kept secret in divine history. Loud, passionate, and barely hidden beneath bedsheets and thunderclouds. Hephaestus eventually caught them, of course, and, being a craftsman, built an invisible net to trap the lovers mid-affair. Then, just for kicks, he invited the entire pantheon to come look. Nothing says marriage counseling like public humiliation in front of your immortal peers. But Aphrodite didn't care. She never cared. Because she wasn't here to play nice or follow rules. She was here to remind everyone what happens when you pretend love is a weakness. She stirred hearts, started wars, sparked jealousy, and occasionally helped mortals fall for cows, swans, or people wildly out of their league. She was chaos in a dress, but underneath the seduction and scandal, there was something else. A kind of divine loneliness. An understanding that being desired isn't the same as being loved. That perfection is a pedestal, not a place you get to sit down. Still, she smiled. Because if the gods were going to tear each other apart over something, it might as well be her. Chapter 10. Blood, Bravado, and the Battlefield Mascot. If the gods had a gym bro, it was Ares. He wasn't subtle, he wasn't clever, he wasn't even particularly strategic. But what he lacked in nuance, he made up for with biceps, battlefield enthusiasm, and the kind of energy usually reserved for someone who still thinks winning a fight counts as character development. Ares was the god of war, but not the poetic, disciplined kind. That was Athena's department. No, Ares represented the raw, reckless mess of conflict. The blood in the mud. The scream in your throat. The part of war that smells like fear and iron and sweat. He loved it. He didn't care who won. Not really. As long as there were bodies flying, spears clashing, and someone screaming dramatically into the sky, Ares was happy. He thrived on the chaos, the adrenaline, the glory, or at least the illusion of it. Wherever he went, pain followed, along with two of his children, Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror. A cute little family. If your idea of parenting involves bringing your kids to the battlefield and naming them after emotional breakdowns. He was never the most popular god. The other Olympians mostly rolled their eyes when he showed up, shirtless and yelling. Athena, in particular, despised him. Not just because they represented opposing philosophies, but because he was the living embodiment of everything she found. Lazy. He charged. She calculated. He punched. She outflanked. He bled. She won. Even Zeus didn't much care for him. His own father once called him the most hateful of all the gods, which, when you consider the company, is a bold statement. But Ares didn't mind, because he wasn't trying to be loved. He was trying to be felt, to shake the ground, to remind the world that peace is a fragile illusion, and all it takes is one sharp blade and a bad decision to bring it crashing down. And then, of course, there was Aphrodite. He might not have been subtle, but he wasn't stupid. He knew beauty when it climbed into his bed. Their affair was the one place where his noise softened. Just a little. With her, he became less god of war, more complicated mess of longing and pride. They had children, lots of them, gods and goddesses of love, desire, panic, revenge, a whole divine soap opera of emotional extremes, which, if anything, just made them more compatible. Still, for all his thunder, Ares was rarely the victor in stories. He fell in battle, got mocked, trapped, wounded. He represented not triumph, but the cost of war, the blood price, the reminder that brute force is rarely the smartest play. But he kept coming back, again and again, because war never really ends. It just changes shape, moves countries, wears a new uniform. And somewhere, always, Ares is there, smirking through the smoke, flexing unnecessarily and screaming his name like someone forgot to invite him to dinner. Chapter 11. Wine, Madness, and the Beautiful Collapse of Control. Dionysus didn't arrive. He happened. Not like a thunderbolt or a battlefield scream, but like a song you didn't realize you were dancing to, or a sip of wine that becomes a third bottle. He was joy, yes, but also delirium. Celebration, yes, but also collapse. The god of wine, theatre, ritual madness, transformation, and every questionable decision made after midnight. His birth naturally was a disaster. Zeus fell for a mortal woman named Semele. She was clever, radiant, and crucially, didn't know not to trust him. Hera always tuned into Zeus's extracurriculars, disguised herself as a kindly old woman, and whispered doubt into Semele's ear. "If he's really a god," she purred, "shouldn't he show you his true form?" Semele asked. Zeus, bound by divine oath and poor impulse control, revealed himself in full celestial fire. She burned. Instantly. But the child she carried didn't. Zeus, in a rare act of semi-decent fatherhood, snatched the fetus from her ashes and stitched it into his own thigh. Yes, you heard that correctly. Dionysus gestated in Zeus's leg. Because when you're the king of gods, regular wombs are for peasants. When the time came, Dionysus was born a second time, already glowing, already wild-eyed, already slightly tipsy. His life was a string of exiles, miracles, and gender-fluid appearances. He wandered the world with an entourage of nymphs, satyrs, and drunken mortals, turning water into wine and boundaries into suggestions. Wherever he went, vines grew, inhibitions died, kings wept, women danced until their feet bled. He wasn't just a god of alcohol, he was a god of release, ritual madness, ecstasy, letting go. Because in a world full of rules, hierarchy, and gods with anger issues, Dionysus offered an escape hatch, a way to blur the edges of identity, grief, and control. He was worshipped with masks, plays, and orgiastic festivals where social order was gleefully flipped upside down. And yet, beneath the wild hair and ivy crown, there was something razor-sharp in him. A quiet understanding that madness isn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It's a response. A necessary breaking point. The scream behind the smile. When mortals mocked him, he didn't get angry. He got poetic. He turned pirates into dolphins, made kings tear their own families apart. He didn't punish with thunder. He handed them their own repressed nightmares and said, "Here, wear this." Eventually he earned his seat on Olympus. Not by force, not by birthright, but by proving that no pantheon is complete without contradiction. That even gods need to lose control sometimes. That joy, like madness, is divine. Dionysus sat among the thunderers, the warriors, the strategists, and the jealous queens. He brought with him laughter, performance, transformation, and just a little bit of holy chaos. And Olympus, for all its arrogance, was never the same. Chapter 12. Mortals, messes, and the gods who just couldn't keep their hands to themselves. For a bunch of eternal, all-powerful cosmic entities, the Olympians had a hard time minding their own business. They meddled, constantly, not just with other gods, but with mortals, those fragile, fleeting creatures who lived, suffered, and died in the span of a god's afternoon nap. Humans fascinated the Olympians, maybe because mortals burned so brightly before going out, maybe because they worshipped the gods with such pathetic sincerity. Or maybe it was just boredom. Whatever the reason, humans became playthings, lovers, pawns, and, far too often, collateral damage. Take Io, for instance, a priestess of Hera, which already put her in the danger zone. Zeus, predictably, took interest, and instead of just writing a poem or showing off his lightning bolts like a normal immortal, he transformed her into a cow. A literal cow. White, terrified, and mooing her way through divine drama. Hera, ever suspicious and 12 steps ahead, pretended not to notice and politely asked for the heifer as a gift. Zeus, cornered by his own idiocy, gave her up. Io spent the next stretch of her life being guarded by a 100-eyed monster, stung by flies, and chased across continents. Because romance, apparently. Then there was Leda, visited by Zeus in the form of a swan. No, you don't need to picture it. Just don't. Europa? Abducted while picking flowers, carried across the sea on the back of a divine bull, also Zeus. Danae? Locked in a tower, visited as a shower of golden light. Guess who? Callisto, Alcmaeon, Semele, Antiope, Ganymede. The list goes on. A parade of mortals touched, transformed, seduced, tricked, or flat out kidnapped. Their reward? A place in myth, or shame, or death. Sometimes all three. But it wasn't just Zeus. Aphrodite destroyed lives with casual affection. Artemis turned men into stags for seeing her bathe. Apollo got rejected, and then cursed his lovers for daring to say no. Hera, when she wasn't trying to kill Zeus's girlfriends, was punishing mortals who stepped out of line, or who simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth is, being noticed by a god was a dangerous honor. Sure, it might mean a few good years, some golden children, maybe a constellation in your name, but more often, it meant suffering wrapped in divine justification. Still, mortals kept praying, building temples, burning offerings, writing hymns, because what else could they do? The gods were chaotic, yes, but they were also powerful, and somewhere, deep down, humans believed they could negotiate. That devotion might buy protection. That sacrifice might mean mercy. It usually didn't. But hope, like wine and prophecy, was addictive. And so the mortals endured, loved, betrayed, bled. And occasionally, when the gods weren't looking too closely, they even got their own stories. Stories that didn't end in tragedy. At least, not always. Chapter 13. Snakes, stone, and a head with one hell of an afterlife. Heroes in Greek mythology were not your modern variety. They didn't smile for the camera or deliver speeches about courage. They were, generally speaking, deeply flawed, wildly violent, and occasionally helpful. If your definition of help includes slaying mythical creatures and accidentally killing family members. One of the earliest and most famous, Perseus. His origin story began, like so many in mythology, with a prophecy and a terrible parenting decision. Acrisius, king of Argos, heard that his grandson would one day kill him. Naturally, instead of going to therapy or just not having grandkids, he locked his daughter Danae in a bronze tower so no man could reach her. Unfortunately, he forgot to account for Zeus, who, never one to respect a locked door, visited her as a shower of golden light. The result? Baby Perseus. Acrisius, horrified, shoved mother and child into a wooden chest and dumped them into the sea. Parenting level. Olympian. They washed up on the island of Seriphos, where Perseus grew up relatively normal. For someone whose father was atmospheric precipitation. things took a turn when King Polydectes, the local creep in charge, decided he wanted Danae for himself. Perseus, protective and probably still processing some abandonment issues, objected. Polydectes responded like any emotionally stable monarch. He tricked Perseus into promising to bring him the head of Medusa. Yes, that Medusa, the Gorgon. The woman with serpents for hair and a stare that turned people into stone. Not a mild metaphor. Literal stone. Garden statue level. Decorative, but dead. Most people would have died at that point. Perseus didn't. Because Perseus, for all his awkward origin and uncertain self-esteem, had one thing going for him. Divine support. Athena gave him a polished shield, perfect for reflecting deadly glares. Hermes handed over a sword and some flying sandals, because decapitation is always better with altitude. The nymphs provided the Helm of Darkness, Hades' invisibility cap, and a magical bag called the Kibisis to carry Medusa's head. Because you don't just throw that in your backpack next to snacks. And so, armed with accessories that would make any D&D player weep with envy, Perseus found the Gorgons. Medusa wasn't always a monster. Once she had been a beautiful maiden, punished after being assaulted by Poseidon in Athena's temple. As usual, the gods punished the victim, not the perpetrator. Divine justice was many things. Fair was not one of them. Now her once beautiful face was surrounded by hissing serpents. Her eyes were weapons. Her isolation, complete. Perseus crept in under the cover of darkness and magic, used the reflection in his shield to navigate, and struck. Clean. Quick. One swing. Her head, still potent, still dangerous, dropped into the bag. From her neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior with a golden sword. Because even in death, Medusa wasn't done making things more dramatic. Perseus would go on to use that head as a kind of divine mace, turning enemies to stone, rescuing Andromeda from a sea monster, and generally upstaging local royalty. Eventually he gave the head to Athena, who placed it on her shield, because apparently murdered rape victim turned into a weapon is what passed for tasteful war decor. And as for Acrisius, the prophecy came true, of course. During a sporting event, Perseus accidentally struck his grandfather with a discus. Instant death. Oops. Because in Greek myth, fate doesn't forget. It just waits. Chapter 14. Labyrinths, mommy issues, and the guy who forgot to text back. Enter Theseus, a prince, a puzzle solver, a guy with too much confidence and just enough charm to survive. He wasn't the strongest hero, not the fastest, but he had a talent for getting into complicated situations and talking his way out of them, usually with someone else's help. His story begins, as usual, with a questionable father figure and a weird test of identity. Theseus grew up not knowing who his dad was. His mother, Aethra, said, "Look, when you're strong enough, go lift that rock over there." Underneath the rock, a sword and sandals left by his alleged father, Aegeus, king of Athens. Because apparently, ancient paternity tests involved CrossFit. Theseus passed. He lifted the rock, claimed the gear, and headed for Athens. Now, most heroes would have taken the sea route. Safe. Director. Not Theseus. He chose the land route, full of robbers, monsters, and murderers. Why? Probably ego. Possibly bad advice. Along the way, he killed a club-wielding thug, a guy who flung people off cliffs, and one particularly creative psychopath who stretched victims to fit an iron bed. By the time he reached Athens, he was basically a walking crime report. He met his father. Yay. Reunion. and immediately got involved in one of the most disturbing Athenian traditions, the tribute to Crete. Every 9 years, Athens had to send 7 boys and 7 girls to King Minos of Crete, where they were thrown into a labyrinth and devoured by the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull reminder that some ancient marital drama had gone very wrong. Theseus volunteered, because nothing says family bonding like offering yourself up as sacrificial maize bait. He sailed to Crete with the others, ready to kill the Minotaur or die trying. Fortunately, he had help. Help, as in Ariadne, King Minos' daughter, who fell for him immediately. Classic. She gave him a ball of thread, a torch, and a look that said, "Please don't be like the others." Into the labyrinth he went. The place was a nightmare. Twisting corridors, stale air, screams echoing from stone, and somewhere, waiting, the Minotaur, born of lust and punishment, raised in darkness, fed on fear. The creature was more than just a monster. It was a living metaphor for everything the gods pretended not to see. Theseus fought hard, and eventually he won. The Minotaur fell. No grand speech, no remorse, just blood on stone and a silent thread leading back to the surface. He escaped, took Ariadne, promised love, promised the usual, and then he abandoned her, left her sleeping on the island of Naxos. No note, no explanation, just gone. Some say Dionysus claimed her, others say she became a goddess. But the message was clear. Heroes may slay monsters, but they're rarely good boyfriends. As for Theseus, he sailed back to Athens, but forgot to change the black sails on his ship to white, the agreed signal to show he was alive. His father, seeing the dark sails from a distance, assumed his son was dead and threw himself into the sea. That's how the Aegean Sea got its name. Theseus, newly crowned and already haunted, became king, and the labyrinth behind him stayed, a symbol of choices, consequences, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the real monster walks out alive. Chapter 14, Labyrinths, Mommy Issues, and the guy who forgot to text back. Enter Theseus, a prince, a puzzle solver, a guy with too much confidence and just enough charm to survive. He wasn't the strongest hero, not the fastest, but he had a talent for getting into complicated situations and talking his way out of them, usually with someone else's help. His story begins, as usual, with a questionable father figure and a weird test of identity. Theseus grew up not knowing who his dad was. His mother, Aethra, said, "Look, when you're strong enough, go lift that rock over there." Underneath the rock, a sword and sandals left by his alleged father, Aegeus, king of Athens. Because apparently, ancient paternity tests involved CrossFit, Theseus passed. He lifted the rock, claimed the gear, and headed for Athens. Now, most heroes would have taken the sea route. Safe, director. Not Theseus. He chose the land route, full of robbers, monsters, and murderers. Why? Probably ego. Possibly bad advice. Along the way, he killed a club-wielding thug, a guy who flung people off cliffs, and one particularly creative psychopath who stretched victims to fit an iron bed. By the time he reached Athens, he was basically a walking crime report. He met his father, reunion, and immediately got involved in one of the most disturbing Athenian traditions, the tribute to Crete. Every 9 years, Athens had to send 7 boys and 7 girls to King Minos of Crete, where they were thrown into a labyrinth and devoured by the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull reminder that some ancient marital drama had gone very wrong. Theseus volunteered, because nothing says family bonding like offering yourself up as sacrificial maize bait. He sailed to Crete with the others, ready to kill the Minotaur or die trying. Fortunately, he had help. Help, as in Ariadne, King Minos' daughter who fell for him immediately. Classic. She gave him a ball of thread, a torch, and a look that said, "Please don't be like the others." Into the labyrinth he went. The place was a nightmare. Twisting corridors, stale air, screams echoing from stone, and somewhere, waiting, the Minotaur, born of lust and punishment, raised in darkness, fed on fear. The creature was more than just a monster. It was a living metaphor for everything the gods pretended not to see. Theseus fought, hard, and eventually he won. The Minotaur fell. No grand speech, no remorse, just blood on stone and a silent thread leading back to the surface. He escaped, took Ariadne, promised love, promised the usual, and then he abandoned her. Left her sleeping on the island of Naxos. No note, no explanation, just gone. Some say Dionysus claimed her. Others say she became a goddess. But the message was clear. Heroes may slay monsters, but they're rarely good boyfriends. As for Theseus, he sailed back to Athens but forgot to change the black sails on his ship to white, the agreed signal to show he was alive. His father, seeing the dark sails from a distance, assumed his son was dead and threw himself into the sea. That's how the Aegean Sea got its name. Theseus, newly crowned and already haunted, became king. And the labyrinth behind him stayed. A symbol of choices, consequences, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the real monster walks out alive. Next, Jason, Medea, and the quest for a magical sheepskin that ruins absolutely everything. Shall we continue with Chapter 15? Chapter 16, Heracles, Headaches, and the 12-task redemption arc. Let's get something out of the way early. It's Heracles, not Hercules. Hercules is the Roman rebrand, slicker, shinier, and a little more Disney. Heracles was the original, rougher, bloodier, significantly less musical. He was strong, yes, ridiculously so. But strength in Greek mythology isn't a superpower. It's a liability. A neon sign that says, "This one suffers dramatically." His origin was naturally messy. Zeus had once again done the whole disguise and seduce routine. This time with Alcmene, a mortal woman with poor luck and strong cheekbones. Hera, ever the loyal wife and lifelong vengeance machine, made Heracles' life a personal project from the moment he took his first breath. As a baby, he strangled 2 serpents she sent to kill him. As a teenager, he accidentally killed his music teacher. And as a grown man, he murdered his own wife and children in a fit of madness. Courtesy of Hera, again, because mental health support did not exist on Mount Olympus. Racked with guilt and seeking redemption, Heracles turned to the Oracle of Delphi. She offered him a path. Complete 12 labors for King Eurystheus, a petty little man with the confidence of wet toast. And so began the most exhausting to-do list in mythological history. 1. The Nemean lion. An unkillable lion with a hide tougher than reason. Heracles strangled it, skinned it using its own claws, and wore the pelt like a statement piece. Fashionable, terrifying, hygienic, probably not. 2. The Linnaean Hydra. A swamp monster with multiple heads. Cut one off, 2 more grow. He solved it by cauterizing the necks with a burning torch and burying the immortal head under a rock. As you do. 3. The Cerenaean Hind. A sacred deer of Artemis. Fast, golden-horned, and absolutely not meant to be touched. He chased it for a year. A year Dot finally caught it, apologized to the goddess, and moved on before anyone asked too many questions. 4. The Erymanthian boar, big, angry, loud. He wrestled it into submission and carried it back like a delivery. 5. The Augean stables, thousands of immortal cattle, centuries of poop. Heracles rerouted 2 rivers and let the water do the work. Efficient if slightly aggressive landscaping. 6. The Stymphalian birds, man-eating metal birds. He used Athena's help to scare them into the air, then shot them down. Divine skeet shooting. 7. The Cretan bull, huge. Magical and previously responsible for the Minotaur mess. He wrestled it, because of course he did. 8. The mares of Diomedes, man-eating horses. He fed them their own master. Problem solved. 9. The girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Things went well until Hera spread rumors. A battle broke out. Heracles got the belt. Nobody had a good time. The cattle of Geryon. He had to kill a triple-bodied giant, wrestle a 2-headed dog, and cross a desert. At one point, he got so annoyed by the sun that he shot arrows at it. The sun blinked first. 11. The apples of the Hesperides, golden apples guarded by a dragon. He didn't steal them himself. He made Atlas get them. Outsourced a labor. Legendary. 12th. Cerberus. Yes, the 3-headed guard dog of the underworld. He asked Hades for permission, got a conditional yes, and dragged the beast back up like it was just another afternoon walk. 12 tasks. 12 symbols of purification, transformation, and god-tier physical therapy. In the end, Heracles achieved something few mortals ever did. Immortality. He died, of course, but was granted a place on Olympus, married Hera's daughter, buried the hatchet, ascended. But even in glory, his story stayed heavy, because Heracles was never just about strength. He was about the cost of it, the mistakes, the madness, the endless drive to fix something that can't be undone. He didn't slay monsters because he was a hero. He did it because he was trying to outrun himself. And the gods, in their usual way, just watched. Chapter 17. Orpheus, Eurydice, and the soundtrack of tragedy. Orpheus didn't have muscles. He didn't slay monsters or wear lion pelts or threaten gods. What he had was worse. He had feelings. And a lyre. The son of a muse and possibly Apollo, Orpheus had music in his bones and melancholy in his blood. When he played, rivers paused, trees leaned in, even stones, famously indifferent to emotion, seemed to weep a little. And then he fell in love. Eurydice, a mortal woman with a soft voice and a soul that matched his. They married. They were happy. For about 15 minutes. Because this is Greek mythology, and happy endings are treated like expensive wine. Rare, fragile, and usually broken by someone knocking over the table. One day, while fleeing an overly enthusiastic admirer, who may or may not have been made of bees, Eurydice stepped on a serpent. One bite later, she was gone. Just like that. The wedding wreath hadn't even wilted yet. Orpheus, crushed, did the only thing he knew how to do. He played, and the world listened. His grief bled through the strings and reached all the way to the underworld. Even Hades, master of death and eternal detachment, shifted in his cold stone seat. Persephone wept. Kerberos whined. Tartaros fell strangely silent. So they granted him something no mortal had ever been offered. He could take Eurydice back. There was just one condition, because there's always a condition. He had to walk in front of her, through the dark tunnels of the underworld, up toward the world of the living, without turning around. Not once, Not even to check. No glances. No confirmation. Just trust. So Orpheus walked, step by step, through silence, his fingers twitching, his heart pounding. Behind him, the sound of her breath, light getting closer, the promise of morning. And then, almost at the surface, he hesitated. Because humans aren't built for certainty. Because love and doubt wear the same face in the dark. Because silence can be louder than any scream. He turned and saw her. One moment, one heartbeat, one tearful, radiant, almost hello, and then she vanished. No fury, no punishment, just the quiet closing of a door that would never open again. Orpheus wandered after that, refused food, refused women, refused the world. He played, and the world once again listened. Until one day, too sad, too raw, too stubborn to be careful, he was torn apart by wild women, either because he rejected them or because Dionysus was bored. It depends on who you ask. His head, still singing, floated down a river. Because that's how this story works. Even in pieces, Orpheus made the world feel something. Not because he conquered death, but because he almost did. Chapter 18, Apples, Pettiness, and the Most Expensive Wedding Crash in History. It started with a wedding, which, to be fair, is where many disasters begin. Peleus and Thetis, he, a mortal hero, she, a sea nymph with commitment issues and a tendency to shapeshift mid-conversation, were tying the knot. Every god was invited. Every deity, every divine +1, every minor celestial entity with a face and a name. Everyone except Eris, the goddess of discord, which, in hindsight, was a bold move. If your job title is literally Goddess of Chaos, being left off the guest list is going to sting. And Eris, being on brand to the last syllable, did what any slighted entity of cosmic mischief would do. She brought a gift. A golden apple. Shiny, perfect, and inscribed with 3 little words. To the fairest. Then she tossed it into the crowd like a grenade made of passive aggression and walked away. The explosion was silent but immediate. 3 goddesses reached for it. Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, and Aphrodite, embodiment of love, beauty, and delightful double standards. Each believed it was obviously hers. Each refused to back down, and so began the first divine beauty contest. They needed a judge, someone neutral, someone mortal, someone who didn't know better. They chose Paris, a Trojan prince, pretty enough to be poetic and naive enough to be useful. He was living a quiet life as a shepherd after his parents had abandoned him at birth. Something about a prophecy that he'd bring ruin to Troy, but no one ever listens to those. Each goddess, being divinely competitive and morally flexible, tried to bribe him. Hera offered political power, make him king of all men. Athena offered wisdom and military glory, make him unbeatable in battle. Aphrodite offered love, specifically the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Guess which one he picked. Paris handed the apple to Aphrodite, and in doing so, doomed a city. Because the most beautiful woman in the world, that was Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, very much not single, very much not available for magical matchmaking. But promises are promises. And so, with a little divine nudging and a lot of bad decision-making, Helen left Sparta and sailed away with Paris to Troy, either in love or under a love spell, depending on how generous you feel. Menelaus was furious, understandably. He called on his brother Agamemnon, who never passed up a good war. Together they rallied the Greek kings. Ships were built, oaths were invoked, spears were sharpened, thousands of men prepared to sail across the sea, all because one man thought a goddess's compliment was worth more than common sense. It would take them 10 years. It would cost them thousands of lives. It would end in fire, treachery, and a horse no one asked for, and all of it. Every arrow, every heartbreak, every glorious bloody mess began with an uninvited goddess and a fruit-flavored insult. Chapter 19. Ships, sulking, and the most overqualified drama queen at war. The ships gathered like storm clouds, hundreds of them, lined up along the Greek coast. Wooden monsters filled with bronze-armored men, horses, weapons, and a staggering amount of ego. Kings, warriors, archers, and one guy who swore he could speak horse, united by a single cause, to bring back Helen of Troy, or, more accurately, to reclaim their pride and make sure no other kingdom thought it was okay to mess with Sparta. Helen was the excuse, honor was the fuel, and war, well, war was just waiting for someone to light the match. At the center of it all stood Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, commander of the Greek forces, and walking embodiment of leadership through sheer arrogance. He was not particularly beloved, but he was loud, rich, and knew how to point at maps. That was enough. But the real weapon of the Greeks wasn't a general, it was Achilles. The son of a mortal king and the sea goddess Thetis, Achilles was the kind of warrior bards dream about. Fast, nearly invincible, and dramatic enough to make every battlefield feel like a theatre stage. His mother, knowing her son was fated to die young if he went to war, had hidden him on an island, disguised as a girl. Cute plan. Didn't work. Odysseus, yes, that Odysseus, who we'll get to later, found him, because clever men always ruin retirement. So Achilles came, with his best friend / complicated emotional lifeline Patroclus, and his magical armor made by gods, and his inner fire that burned with equal parts glory and self-destruction. But before they could set sail, the wind stopped. Why? Because Artemis was pissed. Agamemnon had either offended her, killed a sacred deer, or just existed too confidently. She demanded a price, the sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia. And Agamemnon, after a lot of theatrical soul-searching and exactly zero actual hesitation, handed her over. His wife, Clytemnestra, would not forget this. Ever. The winds returned, the fleet launched, and after far too much rowing and several divine tantrums, they landed at Troy. The war began. Except, not really. Because this wasn't a sprint. It was a 10-year slow burn, full of skirmishes, truces, sulking, and the kind of strategic missteps that make you question how any of these people became kings in the first place. Achilles fought like a god. Until Agamemnon offended him by taking a slave girl, Briseis, from his tent, because power struggles are apparently best handled through petty theft. Achilles didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he withdrew from the battlefield, from the war, from everything. Just packed up his rage, sat in his tent, and refused to lift a finger. Men died. Battles were lost. The Greek morale dropped like a rock in the Aegean, all because their best warrior was too insulted to play nice. And honestly, fair. Because when gods mess with fate, and kings treat daughters like bargaining chips, and the whole war is built on lies and lust, sometimes sitting in your tent with a storm in your chest is the only reasonable response. But of course, it wouldn't last. Because war always finds a way to pull you back in. Chapter 20. Patroclus, Grief, and the Rage that broke the world. In the end, it wasn't politics or honor or even the promise of glory that brought Achilles back to the battlefield. It was the death of the one person he could never live without. Patroclus had grown up alongside him, shared his food, his fire, and his silence. They'd trained together, bled together, and when the war had come, they'd crossed the sea as one. Some said they were brothers. Others whispered lovers. But the gods never bothered to clarify. Because either way, it didn't matter. Achilles loved him. And Patroclus was the only one Achilles trusted with the sharpest thing he owned. His absence. When Achilles withdrew from the war, Patroclus stayed at his side. He watched as the Greeks faltered, their lines breaking, their faith unraveling like cheap thread. And eventually, he asked for the one thing Achilles had left. The armor. "Let me wear it," he said. "Let them think you returned. They need hope, and you've got it gathering dust in the corner of your tent." Achilles hesitated. The armor was more than a shield. It was a symbol. A second skin made of fear and legend. But Patroclus wasn't asking to be him. He was asking to save lives. So Achilles agreed. And for a while the lie worked. The Greeks rallied. The Trojans panicked. Even Hector paused when he saw that familiar glint of bronze flashing across the field. But Patroclus, for all his bravery, wasn't Achilles. And eventually that mattered. He pushed too far, stayed too long, and when Hector struck, he didn't just kill a soldier, he ripped out the heart of a demigod. The moment Achilles learned what had happened, the world around him narrowed to a single point of soundless, suffocating grief. He didn't scream, not at first. Grief like that starts low, like a hum in the bones, and only grows louder once the rage finds its footing. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. He barely spoke. Then, wordlessly, he went to Hephaestus. The god of the forge gave him new armor, one final suit of divine craftsmanship, hammered with the weight of everything Achilles was about to become. And then, he returned to battle. Not as a hero, not even as a man. Achilles came back as a force of nature, something primal and merciless that didn't fight for victory, but for vengeance. He hunted Hector down, and when he caught him, there were no speeches, no warnings, just steel, blood, and the sound of prophecy locking into place. But it didn't end there. Achilles tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it in circles around Troy's walls. Day after day, a grotesque parade of grief and fury. He wasn't trying to win a war. He was trying to make the pain visible, loud, unignorable. Even the gods were unsettled. And then one night, something happened that Achilles didn't expect. A man entered the Greek camp, old, unarmed, wrapped in nothing but grief and royal dignity. It was Priam, king of Troy, Hector's father. He knelt before Achilles, kissed his hand, and begged for his son's body. And something inside Achilles cracked open again. Because for the first time since Patroclus died, he saw beyond his own fury. He saw a father, a mirror, an echo of the man he might have been if the world had allowed it, and he wept. He returned Hector's body, not because of diplomacy, not because of guilt, but because the fire had finally burned itself out. For a moment there was silence, but not for long. Troy still stood, and in a nearby tent, someone was already sketching the shape of a horse. Chapter 21. The wooden lie that burned a city. Troy was tired. After 10 years of siege, betrayal, and divine interference, the city had become a place of waiting. The people no longer flinched at the sound of war drums. The walls still stood, defiant and weary, and the Trojans had begun to believe they just might survive the gods' obsession with their downfall. And then, one morning, the beach was empty. The Greek tents were gone. The ships had vanished. All that remained was silence and a massive wooden horse. It stood just outside the gates, absurd and majestic, with no inscription and no explanation. The Trojans gathered, blinking into the sunlight, confused by the sudden absence of bloodshed. Some celebrated, some squinted suspiciously, and one man, Laocoon, a priest, took one look at the thing and said, "Absolutely not." He warned them, shouted that the Greeks were tricking them, that no sane enemy just packs up and leaves a gift the size of a small temple without a catch. Then, just to really drive the point home, he hurled a spear at the horse's flank. It thudded against the wood, echoed hollow. Inside, Greek warriors held their breath. The Trojans hesitated. Some nodded. Maybe Laocoon had a point. And then the gods stepped in. Because when reason starts to win, Olympus gets twitchy. 2 sea serpents slithered out of the water, divine, massive, and unprovoked, and strangled Laocoon and his sons in front of everyone. The message was loud and mythically clear. Stop asking questions. The Trojans opened the gates. They dragged the horse inside and threw a party, because centuries of religious ritual had taught them nothing about foreshadowing. They drank. They sang. They burned offerings to the gods they thought had blessed them with peace. Then night fell, and the hatch in the horse's belly creaked open. Greek warriors dropped silently onto the stone streets. Achilles was already dead by then, taken down by Paris, who managed one good shot in his entire life. But Odysseus, Menelaus, and the rest of the tired, vengeful Greeks had one last job to do. Troy burned. They opened the gates to let in the returned fleet. They looted temples, tore through palaces, slaughtered anyone who stood too long in the wrong doorway. Priam died at the altar. Andromache was dragged off. Cassandra screamed the truth that no one had listened to for a decade, and was silenced again. And Helen, cause of it all, stood unharmed. Menelaus found her, raised his sword, and didn't use it. Maybe he still loved her. Maybe he couldn't face the truth that no war is ever about one woman. Maybe he just didn't know what to do with her now that the city was ash and echo. When morning came, there was no more Troy, just a smouldering ruin and the quiet shifting of the gods, already bored, already moving on to newer, shinier tragedies. The war was over, but for the survivors, the real stories were just beginning. Chapter 22: Islands, Idiots, and the Longest Way Home. The war was over, but Odysseus hadn't even begun to suffer yet. Troy was rubble. The Greeks, having looted everything that wasn't nailed down, and some things that were, began the journey home. For most, it was a matter of weeks, maybe a storm or two, a quick sacrificial apology to an angry sea god, and back to their thrones. But not Odysseus. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had a brain sharper than most swords, and a mouth that got him into more trouble than any battlefield ever had. He was clever, cunning, and deeply, catastrophically unlucky, mostly because he couldn't keep it shut around gods. Poseidon, for instance, god of the sea, father of monsters, not a fan of being mocked. Especially not by a mortal who thought blinding his one-eyed son and bragging about it was just good storytelling. That moment, after escaping the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus, when Odysseus shouted his real name into the waves just to make sure the insult hit home, that was where things went wrong. Not just wrong, epically, mythically off the rails. Poseidon heard, and he didn't forget. What followed was a 10-year disaster cruise of divine sabotage, poor decisions and island detours that made absolutely no sense unless you assume the universe was actively trying to teach him a lesson. First came the Lotus Eaters, seemingly harmless people offering sweet, forgetful fruit. His crew ate some and promptly forgot what a home was. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ship, like misbehaving children, at a county fair. Then there was Circe, the witch who turned men into pigs, literally. He managed to outwit her using a magical herb, which led to a surprisingly cordial year-long stay that definitely wasn't just an excuse to delay returning to his wife. After that, a trip to the underworld. Because why not? There he met ghosts who gave him warnings about sirens, about whirlpools, about his own future. He listened. Mostly. He tied himself to the mast to hear the sirens sing, and survived both Scylla and Charybdis, though not without losing more men. Speaking of men, Odysseus was running out. They reached the island of Helios, where his crew was told one simple thing: do not eat the sacred cattle. So naturally they barbecued them the second Odysseus took a nap. The punishment? A storm that killed everyone except him. Again. Alone, exhausted, sunburned, and probably over it, Odysseus washed ashore on the island of Calypso, a nymph with abandonment issues and a well-decorated cave. She kept him for 7 years, not by chains but with promises. Comfort, immortality, a warm bed. He said no repeatedly. He wanted to go home, to Ithaca, to Penelope, his wife, to Telemachus, his son, who was now old enough to be passive-aggressively resentful. Eventually, the gods caved. Calypso let him go. He built a raft, got caught in yet another storm, was rescued again by people who were either incredibly kind or completely unaware of how cursed he was. He sat by their fire and told them everything. The war, the Cyclops, the pigs, the ghosts, the storms, the fact that going home had become less of a destination and more of a cosmic punishment. And the worst part? He wasn't even there yet, but he was close. And home. Home had changed. Chapter 23, Strings, Suitors, and a home not quite recognizing him. When Odysseus finally set foot on Ithaca, he didn't announce himself. No trumpets, no poetic reunion, no heroic pose in front of the setting sun. Just a tired man in rags, covered in sea salt, scars, and more trauma than any one mortal should carry. After 20 years away, 10 at war, 10 trying not to die, he had returned to find his kingdom. Occupied. The palace was full of men. Not soldiers, not kings. Just smug, well-fed suitors lounging around on his furniture, drinking his wine and aggressively flirting with his wife. They all wanted Penelope's hand, and more importantly, Odysseus's throne. Because after 2 decades, most people had assumed he was dead. Some even hoped so. But Penelope hadn't given up. Not entirely. She told them she'd choose one of them as soon as she finished weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law. Every day she wove. Every night she secretly undid the work. 3 years of elegant stalling, unraveled in the dark. Still, time wore thin. Rumors spread. The pressure mounted. And just as Penelope's patience neared its end, her husband slipped back into his own home disguised as a beggar, with no fanfare, no allies, and one very specific goal: revenge. But first, he tested everything. His servants, his son, even his dog. Old Argos lying in the dirt, recognized him immediately, tail thumping once before he died on the spot, as if waiting his entire life for that moment. Odysseus revealed himself to Telemachus, now grown into a man with his father's temper and none of his restraint. Together, they plotted quietly, carefully. They waited for the right day. Then came the contest. Penelope, in one final act of impossible faith, announced she would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined in a row. A feat no one but her husband had ever managed. The suitors laughed. One by one, they failed. The bow was too stiff, too stubborn, too intimately linked with the man they'd all written off. Then came the beggar, mocked, jeered at, but allowed a turn, if only for the entertainment. He took the bow in his hands, and it fit, like memory, like home. The string sang, the arrow flew, 12 axe heads pierced in perfect silence, and before anyone had time to scream, the second arrow was loosed, straight through the heart of the first suitor. The slaughter was precise, methodical, quiet even. Odysseus, with his son and a few loyal servants, cleansed his house room by room, arrows first, then swords. Then the blood-slick floor was still. When it was over, only Penelope remained. She didn't run to him, didn't swoon. Instead, she tested him, asked him about the bed he built, carved from the roots of a tree, immovable and secret. And when he described it, exactly unprompted, she finally knew. He was home, older, scarred, changed, but home. And for the first time in 20 years, Ithaca slept without knives in the shadows. Chapter 24. Riddles, Fate, and the man who shouldn't have asked questions. If the Greek gods had a favorite pastime, it wasn't war or wine or seducing mortals while pretending to be animals. It was watching people try to outrun prophecy, and nobody ran harder or fell faster than Oedipus. His story didn't begin with him, of course. Like most catastrophes in Greek myth, it started with parents making terrible decisions in response to even worse omens. King Laius of Thebes was told by an oracle that his own son would one day kill him. Reasonable reaction? Maybe rethink your parenting approach. Laius's reaction? Get the baby as far away as possible, ideally dead. He pierced the infant's ankles and handed him to a servant, who was supposed to abandon him in the mountains. The servant couldn't do it. Instead, the child was given to a shepherd, who brought him to Corinth, where the king and queen, childless and delighted, adopted him and named him Oedipus, which, fun fact, means swollen foot. Not exactly subtle foreshadowing. Oedipus grew up smart, strong, and just curious enough to be dangerous. One day, someone mentioned he wasn't his parents' biological son. Naturally, he went to the Oracle at Delphi to ask what was going on. The Oracle didn't answer his actual question. Instead, it told him this: you're gonna kill your father and marry your mother. So Oedipus, being the rational, upright guy he believed himself to be, did what any good man would. He fled. Away from Corinth, away from the people he thought were his real parents, determined to avoid the fate that now hung over him like a sword. And that's when everything started falling neatly into place. On the road to Thebes, Oedipus got into a violent argument with a stranger over who had the right of way. Because fate doesn't need a grand stage, just an ego and a crossroads. He killed the man, walked away. The man was King Laius. Unaware, Oedipus continued on and came across a city in crisis. Thebes was under the grip of the Sphinx, a monster with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of someone who had been asked one too many dumb questions. The the Sphinx posed riddles to travelers, and those who answered incorrectly were, let's say, removed from the conversation. Oedipus didn't flinch. The riddle came. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? He answered, man. Crawling as a baby, walking as an adult, leaning on a cane in old age. The Sphinx, dramatically offended by someone finally doing their homework, threw herself off a cliff. Thebes was free. The people cheered. Oedipus was hailed as a hero, and because the city needed a king and the throne was now vacant, they offered him the crown and the hand of the queen. He accepted both. Jocasta, his new wife, was regal, kind, and slightly older than him. They ruled together, had children, built a life, and for years, everything was fine, until the past came calling. A plague struck Thebes. The oracle was consulted again. The gods were angry, it said, because the killer of Laius still lived, unpunished. And so Oedipus did what any responsible king would. He launched an investigation into the murderer. Slowly, painfully, the truth surfaced. Piece by piece, witnesses, servants, scars, memories, and finally the realization. He was the killer. Jocasta was his mother. Their children, his siblings. Jocasta took her own life. Oedipus, in a moment of devastation that only Greek tragedy can render, with such bleak theatricality, blinded himself. With the pins from her dress, he exiled himself, became a wandering ghost of a man, a walking warning that no amount of cleverness can outsmart destiny. And the gods, they said nothing, just watched, quiet and satisfied, like a playwright watching their plot twist land perfectly. Because in the world of myth, the real tragedy isn't that fate catches up with you. It's that you help it do so. Chapter 25. Blood, bathtubs, and the worst welcome home in history. When Agamemnon returned from Troy, he expected applause. 10 years of war, 10 years of strategy, sacrifice, and speeches shouted over campfires. He led the Greek forces across the Aegean, fought the Trojans, watched Achilles sulk, and survived the wrath of more gods than any sane man would dare provoke. Now, finally, he was home. Unfortunately, so was his wife. Clytemnestra had been waiting. Not patiently. Not silently. Not with fresh sheets and a celebratory meal. She had been waiting with fury in her bones, and a blade hidden behind polite conversation. Because while Agamemnon had been off winning battles and collecting concubines, Clytemnestra had been left to rule Mycenae, alone. And she had not forgotten the price she paid to send her husband off to glory. Their daughter, Iphigenia, sacrificed to the gods so the wind would blow and the ships would sail. A divine trade, they called it. A necessary evil. Clytemnestra called it murder. So when Agamemnon returned, triumphant and arrogant, he brought with him more than his laurels. He brought a new war prize. Cassandra, princess of Troy, priestess of Apollo, cursed to see the future and be believed by absolutely no one. She knew what was coming. She said nothing. Because no one would have listened anyway. Clytemnestra greeted her husband with a smile, praised him, welcomed him, drew him a bath. There was no screaming, no storm, just steam. And then, while he bathed, she killed him. Some say it was a net, others an axe. Either way, it was not quick, and it was not undeserved. Cassandra died too, silent, resigned, a casualty of a story that never had room for truth spoken too soon. Clytemnestra stood over the bodies, blood on her hands, and told the court exactly why she had done it. Not with shame, with conviction. She wasn't a madwoman, she wasn't hysterical. She was a queen, a mother, and a woman who had been patient far too long. But Greek mythology never lets revenge be the final word, because Clytemnestra had a son, Orestes. He'd been away when it happened, raised elsewhere, away from the rot and resentment festering in the marble halls of his birthright. And when he returned and learned what his mother had done, when he stood in the same doorway where his father had once stood, he made a choice. He killed her, matricide, in the name of justice. And for that, the Furies came. Not metaphorical ones. Real, clawed, ancient forces of vengeance. They hounded him, drove him half mad, until the gods finally took pity and dragged the whole mess into court, literally inventing the first trial by jury in Greek mythology just to sort it out. Orestes was acquitted, but no one walked away clean, because in houses built on blood, even justice starts to look like a fresh coat of paint over old cracked walls. Chapter 26. Theseus, Farewells, and the Ocean that forgot to wait. By the time Theseus returned to Athens, the heroic glow had already begun to fade. He'd done the things heroes are meant to do: slain the Minotaur, escaped the labyrinth, navigated the jealous tempers of kings and gods. He had left behind broken curses, stitched together alliances, and one very abandoned princess on an island who would probably be texting in all caps if Wi-Fi existed. But for all his strength and cleverness, Theseus forgot one thing: the sails. When he left Athens to face the Minotaur, he told his father, King Aegeus, that he would raise white sails on his return if he lived, and black if he perished. A simple code. A thread between father and son across the sea. Theseus survived. Barely. But in the chaos of escape, or the haze of triumph, or perhaps just the kind of arrogance that creeps in when you've cheated death one too many times, he forgot to change the sails. So when Aegeus saw black on the horizon, he didn't wait. He threw himself from the cliffs into the sea that would one day bear his name. And just like that, Theseus inherited a throne soaked in silence. He tried to rule, really he did, but Athens was no place for myth. It required laws, order, the slow, patient work of politics. Theseus was a man of action, not debate, of quests, not councils, and so he wandered. Not across the lands this time, but through choices. He joined other heroes, took part in strange adventures. At one point, he and Pirithous, his equally unhinged companion, decided to kidnap goddesses as wives. Yes, goddesses, because nothing says I've learned nothing quite like attempting to date Persephone. That particular plan ended poorly. Trapped in the underworld, frozen to a magical chair, Theseus remained there until Heracles came to fetch him. Pirithous wasn't so lucky. He stayed behind, a permanent reminder that some ideas are just bad from the start. Theseus eventually returned to the mortal world, but something had shifted. He was no longer the golden boy. The crowds didn't cheer quite as loud. The myths had moved on without him, and he found himself in the awkward twilight between legend and obsolescence. Exiled, forgotten, pushed aside by the same people who once carved his face into coins. And then, one day, on the island of Skyros, he was pushed, literally, off a cliff. Some say it was an accident. Others, a political murder wrapped in a polite shrug. Either way, Theseus disappeared into the sea, the same sea that had taken his father. Athens would later honor him, of course, build statues, tell stories, pretend they hadn't turned their backs when he needed them, because nothing cements a legacy like death far away from the people who once sang your name. Chapter 27. Jason, Medea, and the Art of Burning Everything to the Ground. Jason didn't set out to become the poster child for doomed relationships. He just wanted his throne back. Born to royalty, Jason was supposed to inherit the kingdom of Iolcus, but as it often goes in Greek mythology, his uncle Peleus had other plans, namely, seizing the crown and sending the rightful heir far away to be quietly forgotten. That worked for a while, until Jason returned, grown, confident, and somehow missing a sandal, which, in a world fueled by prophecy and paranoia, was a bad look. An oracle had warned Peleus to beware a man with one sandal, and when Jason walked into court with exactly that fashion statement, Peleus went pale. But instead of killing him on the spot, Peleus offered a deal. Retrieve the Golden Fleece, a mythical object guarded by monsters and owned by a distant, hostile kingdom, and the throne would be his. Jason, either brave or stupid or both, agreed, and thus began the voyage of the Argo, a ship filled with heroes, gods in disguise, and more testosterone than strategy. Among them were Hercules, Orpheus, and a handful of others who really should have had their own HR department. Their destination was Colchis, a kingdom at the edge of the known world, where the Golden Fleece hung glittering in a sacred grove, guarded by a sleepless dragon. Getting it wasn't just a heist, it was a suicide mission. Luckily, or unluckily, Jason caught the attention of someone far more dangerous than any dragon. Medea, daughter of King Aeetes, granddaughter of the sun god Helios, priestess of Hecate, sorceress, and, at the time, absolutely besotted with Jason. Thanks to the meddling of Hera and Aphrodite, who saw Jason's cause as noble enough to nudge fate, Medea fell in love. Hard. She betrayed her father, drugged the dragon, and helped Jason steal the fleece. They fled together with a trail of curses snapping at their heels. And if you're thinking, wow, that escalated quickly, you haven't heard the half of it. As they escaped, Medea delayed her father's pursuit by killing her own brother, cutting him into pieces and tossing them into the sea. Her father, horrified, had to stop and collect the remains. Jason didn't object. Not then. They returned to Iolcus, fleece in hand, but Peleus refused to give up the throne, so Medea fixed that too, by tricking his daughters into murdering him. It involved boiling him in a cauldron, under the impression that it would make him young again. It did not. Jason and Medea were exiled. They found refuge in Corinth, had children, tried, briefly, to live something resembling a normal life. And then Jason got ambitious. He decided to marry the Corinthian king's daughter, Glauce, because political stability, apparently, mattered more than the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Medea, now scorned and side-eyed by the whole city, was handed a simple message: leave quietly. She did not. Instead, she sent Glauce a gift, a poisoned robe that clung to her skin and burned her alive. The king tried to save her, touched the fabric, and died beside her. A 2-for-1 revenge special. Then Medea did the unthinkable. She killed her own children. Not out of madness, but as the final blade in Jason's soul. She wanted him broken, and she succeeded. When he collapsed in grief, she disappeared in a chariot pulled by dragons. Because if you're going to exit a story after filicide and arson, you might as well do it in style. Jason lived on, but barely. A hollow man, drifting through the years, forgotten by the gods he once served. In the end, he died alone, struck down by a piece of the Argo, rotting in the sand. Because in Greek myth, betrayal doesn't just destroy you, it waits, and it circles back. Chapter 28. A glance, a ghost, and the song that almost undid death. Orpheus never looked like a hero. No bronze muscles, no bloody trophies, just a lyre and a voice that could make the wind pause mid-breath. He wasn't built for battle, he was built for heartbreak. And that, of course, made him one of the most dangerous men in myth. When Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, it wasn't the loud kind of love. It wasn't marked by war or conquest. It was soft, private, a quiet world of glances and shared silences. They married. The gods might have even smiled, briefly. And then she died, bitten by a snake. One moment here, the next not. No tragic curse, no divine punishment, just bad timing and worse luck. The kind of death that leaves behind unfinished conversations and cold bedsheets. Orpheus unraveled. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep, he just played. His music, once filled with wonder, became a dirge so pure and aching that even the stones seemed to mourn. Trees leaned in to listen. Animals crept closer. And somewhere deep below, even Hades took notice. The underworld didn't do favors. But this was different. Orpheus descended. Not with weapons, not with tricks, just with his grief, strapped to his back like a second spine. He walked past ghosts, past memories, past every warning carved into the bones of men who thought they could bargain with death. And he played. In the throne room of the dead, Orpheus sang for Eurydice. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He simply told the truth, in a language no god could ignore. Even Persephone wept. Hades, unmoved for centuries, finally gave in. Not out of pity, but out of something older. Recognition, perhaps. She can go, he said, on one condition. She would follow Orpheus out, step by step, through the tunnels, toward the light. But he must not look back. Not once. Not until they were both outside. No glances, no whispered reassurances. Just trust. And so he walked. Each step forward echoed with the sound of her behind him. Quiet, fragile, nearly weightless. He felt her presence like a shadow on his heel. But the deeper they climbed, the heavier his doubt became. Was she really there? Was this a trick? Was he alone again? The exit was close. Just a few more steps. But silence, as it often does, twisted into something unbearable. He turned, and there she was, her face lit by the first flicker of daylight, her hand just reaching out, her mouth almost forming his name. And then she was gone. No explosion, no scream, just the quiet slide of finality as she was pulled back into the dark. Orpheus staggered out alone. He didn't go back. He couldn't. The gods don't offer second chances. They barely offer first ones. For the rest of his days, he wandered. Refused other women. Refused joy. Played songs that made the sky feel smaller. Eventually he died too. Some say it was by the hands of those who hated his silence. Others say he simply walked into the dark, no longer needing a reason to stay in the light. But his music lived on, because even the gods, for all their power, could not forget the man who almost stole a soul back from death. Chapter 29. Pygmalion, Perfection, and the Dangerous Art of Wanting More. Pygmalion was a sculptor, not the messy kind covered in clay and sweat, but the obsessive sort. Quiet, neat, meticulous. He lived alone, by choice. Claimed women were too flawed, too loud, too much. Which was ironic, considering what he built next. One day, he started carving a statue. Just another commission, or so it seemed. But as the days went on, it became something else. She was beautiful. Not just attractive, perfect. Skin smoother than marble had any right to be. Lips frozen mid-thought, eyes that looked like they were about to blink. And slowly, Pygmalion stopped seeing her as a project. She became the room's only gravity. He dressed her, brought her flowers, whispered to her in the evenings like she might whisper back. He named her Galatea, though she never asked for it. Because of course she didn't. She was stone. But Pygmalion didn't care. To him, she was more real than anyone else. No messy emotions, no surprises, just stillness, beauty, control. At some point, he stopped bothering with real people. While the city outside bustled and argued and made mistakes, he stayed indoors with his statue and imagined it was love. And then, one day, he prayed. Not to a minor god. Not to one of the old household spirits. He went straight to Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and generally poor impulse control. He asked her quietly, desperately, to make Galatea real, and for reasons only the gods understand, she listened. No thunder, no sparks, just the softest change. A fingertip that warmed, eyes that moved, breath. The statue exhaled, stretched, looked at him, and smiled. Galatea was alive. Pygmalion was overjoyed, naturally. He'd been given everything he wanted. The perfect woman, sculpted to his exact standards, now walking and speaking and existing because he asked nicely enough. They married. The people cheered. The gods nodded, pleased with the story. But here's the part they never really tell. No one asked Galatea if she wanted any of this. She'd been created in silence, loved before she knew what love was, molded to fit someone else's idea of perfection. And sure, maybe she smiled, maybe she learned to be happy, or maybe she woke up in a world that already thought it knew her, and never stopped calling that love. Myths rarely ask what happens after the ending. They just assume that being wanted is enough. Chapter 30. Narcissus, Echo, and the sound of loving the wrong person. Narcissus was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that turns heads, silences rooms, and ruins lives without even trying. He didn't flirt, he didn't chase, he didn't need to. People fell for him like it was their job, and he walked right past, blissfully uninterested. He wasn't cruel exactly, just indifferent, detached, as if the entire concept of other people was mildly inconvenient. And then came Echo, a mountain nymph cursed by Hera, because, as always, the gods had fragile egos and too much free time. Echo's punishment was simple and cruel. She could no longer speak her own thoughts. She could only repeat what others said. No questions, no declarations, just echoes. She was still clever, still kind, still her. And when she saw Narcissus, she fell. Hard. The way people always did with him. But unlike the others, she couldn't tell him how she felt. Couldn't ask him to stay. Couldn't explain the curse or the ache, or how exhausting it was to live inside someone else's words. She followed him in silence, through woods and streams, memorizing his every expression, until one day he called out, "Is anyone there?" And from the shadows, Echo whispered back, "Anyone there?" It went on like that. Him speaking, her responding. A conversation made of fragments, built on a false connection. When he finally saw her, she stepped into the clearing, heart racing, hands open. He looked at her like she was noise, a distraction, something unwanted. "I'd rather die," he said, walking away. Echo repeated it. "Rather die," and crumbled behind him. She didn't chase, she didn't cry out. She just faded, bit by bit, until all that remained was her voice, haunting valleys and caves, answering strangers who never knew they were speaking to a ghost. But the story doesn't end with Echo, because Narcissus, smug and untouched, eventually wandered to a still pool. He leaned over to drink and saw a reflection staring back. And for the first time in his life, he was captivated. Not by someone else, but by himself. He didn't recognize the face in the water as his own. He just knew it was perfect. And he wanted it, reached for it, spoke to it, waited for it to respond. But it never did. He stayed there, hour after hour, whispering to the surface, watching ripples distort the thing he thought he loved. He forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, forgot to move. Eventually he died there. Some say he drowned. Others say he simply withered away, consumed by longing for something he could never touch. In his place, a flower bloomed, delicate, white, leaning toward its own reflection in the water. The gods named it after him, because of course they did. Chapter 31. Daedalus, Icarus, and the Blueprint for Disaster. Daedalus was the kind of genius you'd want designing your palace but not raising your kids. Inventor, engineer, architect to kings, he built things most mortals couldn't even imagine. Doors that opened themselves, statues that moved, and most famously, a labyrinth so cunningly designed even the builder had to leave himself breadcrumbs. It was a job for King Minos of Crete, who needed somewhere to stash a rather inconvenient secret. A monstrous son born of a cursed union. Half man, half bull, all teeth, the Minotaur. Locking him away wasn't just a practical choice. It was self-preservation dressed in marble. Daedalus did the job perfectly. Too perfectly. When the Minotaur eventually became part of a nasty diplomatic incident involving tribute and Athenian teenagers, Daedalus found himself on the wrong side of Minos' favor. Why? Because he'd helped Theseus escape the labyrinth. A helpful hint here, a bit of string there, it didn't go unnoticed. Minos, not exactly known for mercy, decided to imprison the architect and his son, Icarus, in a tower. Not a dungeon, just high enough that escape was impossible. Or so he thought. Daedalus, being Daedalus, started thinking vertically. He watched birds, collected feathers, melted wax, sketched plans in the dust, and eventually he built wings. 2 sets, lightweight, functional, beautiful. They strapped them on, father and son, ready to leave the island behind, gliding like gods. Before takeoff, Daedalus gave Icarus one rule. Just one. Don't fly too low. The sea spray will soak the wings. Don't fly too high. The sun will melt the wax. Simple, balanced, practical. But Icarus was young and stupid, and thrilled by the feeling of weightlessness, the wind in his face, the sky stretching endless above him. It felt like freedom, like invincibility. So he flew higher. The wax softened, the feathers loosened, and then gravity, that old patient god, pulled him back. Daedalus heard the splash. By the time he found the boy's broken body, the sky had already closed over him like nothing had happened. He kept flying, because that's all you can do when your greatest creation is also your greatest loss. He landed in Sicily, built more things, grew older, wiser, sadder. People still asked him for blueprints, of course. Asked him to make marvels. He always obliged, but he never built wings again. Chapter 32. Pandora, Curiosity, and the last thing left behind. Before there were people, there were gods, and before there was hope, there was a trick. A petty, shining, beautifully wrapped punishment. It began with fire. Prometheus, that eternal optimist with a talent for stealing things from powerful beings who really don't like being stolen from, gave humanity fire. Not just flames, but progress, warmth, knowledge, the first flicker of control over the world. Zeus was not amused. He'd warned Prometheus not to meddle, said mortals weren't ready. But Prometheus lit the spark anyway, and Zeus, king of Olympus and holder of grudges, decided to send a message. He wouldn't just punish the thief, he'd punish the ones who received the gift. So he ordered Hephaestus to sculpt a woman. Not just any woman, the perfect one. A being of beauty and grace, with charm from Aphrodite, music from Apollo, cleverness from Hermes, and just a touch of mischief from each. She was flawless, and she was dangerous. They named her Pandora, which, roughly translated, means all-gifted, which sounds lovely until you realize those gifts included curiosity sharp enough to slice open a new kind of pain. They gave her to Epimetheus, brother of Prometheus, who, despite all warnings, accepted her without question. She arrived with a box, or more accurately, a jar, small, sealed, glowing slightly with divine warning. And one rule, don't open it. And for a while, she didn't. She lived, smiled, laughed, grew restless, because you can only live next to mystery for so long before the silence starts to itch. What was in the jar? Why did the gods care? Why give someone a gift only to forbid them from using it? So one day, when the house was quiet and the air was still, she opened it. Just a crack. And the world changed. Outpoured things humanity had never known. Disease, hatred, envy, greed, famine, betrayal. Each one a dark wind that scattered across the earth, lodging itself in skin and thought and bone. She slammed the lid shut, but too late. Everything had escaped. Everything. Except one small thing that lay curled at the bottom of the jar, shivering. Hope. Some say Pandora let it out too. Others say she kept it safe, sealed away until the world needed it most. Either way, humanity was never the same. Now we live with hesitation, trust with conditions, live with the quiet knowledge that everything can break, and still, somehow, go on. Because hope, as small and absurd as it is, always stays behind. And that, Zeus never quite managed to destroy. Chapter 33. Persephone, pomegranate seeds, and the deal that split the world. Persephone didn't plan on becoming queen of the underworld. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and she'd grown up surrounded by sunlight and spring. Fields bloomed wherever she walked. The world seemed to lean toward her like a flower to the sun. There was nothing dark in her life. No death, no cold. Just green things and the people who grew them. And then one day, she was picking flowers. That's how it started. Just a quiet moment in a meadow. Nothing special. She reached down to pluck a blossom, and the earth split open beneath her feet. A chariot surged up from the cracks, horses black as midnight, and behind them, a man with a crown of bone and eyes like still water. Hades didn't say much. He didn't need to. He reached out and took her hand, and before she could scream, they were gone, swallowed by the earth, leaving only a scattering of petals behind. For the first time in her life, Persephone saw a world without light. Hades ruled the underworld, but he ruled it in silence. He didn't drag her to a throne or lock her in a tower. He gave her space, gardens of asphodel, quiet halls of polished stone. He didn't demand her love, but he didn't ask if she wanted to stay either. Above, Demeter searched, across fields and forests, mountains and seas, and wherever she passed, nothing grew. The earth withered, crops failed, people starved. The gods noticed. Eventually someone told the truth. Persephone had been taken, not killed, not lost, just hidden beneath the soil like a secret. Demeter confronted Zeus, and Zeus, who had known all along, shrugged. He brokered a compromise because that's what gods do when they don't want to admit they've made a mess. Persephone could return, on one condition. If she hadn't eaten anything in the underworld, she was free to go. But no one had told Persephone the rules, and she had eaten just a few pomegranate seeds, red as blood, sweet as temptation. 6 of them. Not a feast, not a betrayal, just a small, simple moment of hunger. But it was enough. Zeus declared she would split her time, 6 months above, 6 below, and so began the seasons. When Persephone returns to the world, Demeter rejoices. The land blooms. Spring comes in her footsteps. But when her daughter descends again, Demeter grieves, and the world goes cold. Persephone is no longer just the girl who picked flowers. She is queen now. Not in name only, but in presence. She walks among the dead with steady steps. She does not fear the dark, because she lives in both worlds, and in doing so, she changed them forever. Chapter 34. The Horse, the City, and the Last Night of Troy. By the time the Greeks rolled that giant wooden horse up to the gates of Troy, the war had been dragging on for 10 years. 10 years of blood and bravado, of gods taking sides and heroes falling faster than their stories could keep up. The Trojans were tired. The Greeks were worse. Everyone wanted it to end, but no one wanted to admit they'd lost. And then one morning, the battlefield was empty. No clatter of swords, no shouting, no campfires on the horizon. The Greek ships were gone, their tents abandoned, and left behind was the strangest farewell gift in the history of warfare. A massive wooden horse, perched on wheels, too big to ignore. Naturally, everyone had an opinion. Some thought it was a trap. Others said it was an offering. A few whispered that it was a peace gesture, a symbol of surrender to Athena. And then there was Sinon, a single Greek left behind, conveniently captured by the Trojans. Tear-streaked, trembling, very good at pretending he hadn't rehearsed the whole thing. He told them a story, said the Greeks had fled, cursed by the gods, that the horse was holy, too sacred to harm, that touching it would bring ruin, but bringing it into the city would make Troy invincible. He lied with the conviction of a man who knew no one would fact-check. And the Trojans? They bought it. Not all of them. Laocoon, priest, skeptic, professional party pooper, stood up and said what half the city was thinking. This is ridiculous. Burn it. Then 2 serpents slithered out of the sea and ate him alive. Public opinion shifted very quickly after that. So they opened the gates, they dragged the horse inside, wheeled it through the streets like a trophy, parked it in the square, and celebrate like they'd actually won something. That night, while the Trojans drank, sang, and finally exhaled after a decade of war, the trap inside the horse began to creak. A hidden door opened. Out crawled Odysseus, Menelaus, and a handful of hand-picked soldiers, the kind who knew how to move without making a sound. They slid down ropes, opened the gates from the inside. Outside the city walls, the Greek fleet returned, sails black against the moon. They hadn't left. They'd just been waiting. The rest was fire. Troy didn't fall in battle. It collapsed in its sleep. In the soft hours between wine and dreams, while the city danced and told itself stories of victory, the truth came through the doors it had opened willingly. By morning, Troy was ash, and the Greeks sailed home victorious, at least for a while, because the gods, they were far from done. Chapter 35, Arachne, Athena, and the pattern that got out of hand. Arachne was nobody special. She wasn't royal, she wasn't divine, she didn't have golden blood or a tragic backstory. What she had were hands, quick, precise, unreasonably good hands. And with those hands, she could weave. Not just decent market day cloth or passable wall hangings. No. Arachne's work looked like it had been kissed by the gods. Silk threads turned to light. Patterns flowed like stories. Her tapestries shimmered with life, detail, and a kind of arrogance only genius can justify. People came from other cities just to watch her work. They whispered she must have been taught by Athena herself. Arachne heard those whispers, and she laughed. She wasn't flattered. She was insulted. "I didn't learn this from a goddess," she said. "I'm just better." And in a universe where the gods are very much listening, this was not ideal. Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and weaving, not necessarily in that order, heard her. And for once, she didn't arrive with thunder or lightning. She disguised herself as an old woman and shuffled into Arachne's workshop, watching from the shadows as the girl worked. The tapestry under Arachne's hands was, of course, breathtaking. The old woman gave her a chance. A small, quiet warning. "Show humility," she said. "Give thanks to the gods for your talent." But Arachne just rolled her eyes. "I'm better than any god," she replied, with the confidence of someone who has never been smited. Athena didn't pretend anymore. She dropped the disguise, stood tall in the center of the room, shimmering in full goddess mode. Looms trembled, threads pulled tight on their own. "You want a contest?" Athena asked. "Let's weave." And so they did. Side by side, goddess and mortal, each thread a declaration. Athena wove the glory of Olympus, order, triumph, power. Her tapestry was divine propaganda, glowing with righteous precision. Arachne's, on the other hand, told a different story. It showed the gods in all their worst moments. Zeus disguised as animals to seduce women, Apollo punishing mortals for minor insults, Hera's jealous rampages. Every panel was perfectly woven, brutally honest, and absolutely unforgiving. When it was done, Athena stepped back. She couldn't find a single flaw, not one stitch out of place, and that was the problem. The work was flawless and insulting. Athena's pride snapped like a thread under pressure. In one motion, she tore Arachne's tapestry apart, shredded it, scattered the threads across the floor. Arachne didn't protest, didn't argue. She just stood there, silent, and reached for a rope. She was ready to end it. But Athena, watching, stopped her. Not out of mercy, not out of guilt, out of pettiness. She touched the girl and transformed her, not into stone, not into shadow, but into a spider. "Fine," she said. "Weave forever." And Arachne did. No longer a girl, no longer proud, but still weaving. In corners, in silence. Her pattern's smaller now, but still perfect, and still watching. Because the gods always win. But sometimes, the story sticks to them anyway. Chapter 36, Sisyphus, the rock, and the price of knowing too much. Sisyphus was a man who always knew just a bit more than he should. He wasn't a warrior or a poet or anyone destined for a tragic ballad. He was a king, clever, charming, and deeply inconvenient to the gods. The kind of man who asked too many questions, remembered too many details, and never passed up an opportunity to cheat the system, which, in ancient Greece, was practically a capital offense. He ran his kingdom with a merchant's grin and a conman's patience. He lied to guests, betrayed allies, and tricked death not once, but twice, which is frankly excessive. The first time he caught Thanatos, the actual embodiment of death, in chains. It sounds like the setup for a bad joke, but it worked. Sisyphus lured him in, trapped him, and suddenly no one on Earth could die. Not from wounds, not from sickness, not even from old age. Wars became bloodless tantrums. The sick just stayed sick. The world paused, awkwardly alive. Eventually Ares stormed in, furious that battles weren't producing corpses, and freed Thanatos with a divine eye roll. Sisyphus was sentenced to die for real this time. But he wasn't done. Before dying, he made his wife promise not to bury his body. A weird request, but she agreed. So when he arrived in the underworld, he complained loudly that proper funeral rites hadn't been performed, claimed he'd been wronged, unjustly sent, that it was all a terrible mistake. Hades, baffled by the audacity, let him return to the living to sort things out. And of course, Sisyphus never came back. He lived comfortably for years, smug and very much alive, until the gods had finally had enough. When they dragged him back down for good, they didn't bother with a trial. They gave him a rock, not a symbolic one, an actual, massive, joyless boulder. His punishment? Roll it up a hill. Every day. Forever. And every time he reached the top, it would slip, slide, crash back to the bottom, and he'd start again. No audience, no purpose, just the endless grind of failure on repeat. It wasn't torture in the usual sense. No whips, no flames, just the weight of knowing, of understanding the task, of almost succeeding, again and again and again. That was the real punishment. Because Sisyphus wasn't a fool, he understood irony, he recognized the trap, he knew this was about ego, about challenging gods who don't like to be challenged. And yet every day, he still pushed the rock. Maybe out of spite, maybe out of stubborn hope, or maybe just because he refused to give the gods the satisfaction of quitting. Some say there's dignity in that, others just see futility, but either way, the boulder waits. And Sisyphus, ever clever, ever cursed, keeps walking toward it. Chapter 37, Tantalus, the dinner party that doomed a dynasty. Tantalus was the kind of man who started life on the gods' guest list. Son of Zeus, or so he claimed. A king, wealthy, respected, dripping with privilege. He dined on Olympus itself, drank nectar with the immortals, chatted casually with Hera and Apollo like they were neighbors across a fence. And like many who get too comfortable in rooms they didn't build, he made the mistake of thinking he belonged there. At first his crimes were minor. He stole a little nectar, took ambrosia home to impress his friends, whispered divine secrets over wine at mortal banquets, just to feel important. Annoying, yes, but not unusual. Most kings with god complexes at least tried to act subtle, but then Tantalus decided to test the gods, really test them. He invited them to dinner, a lavish spread, gold cups, fine wine. The kind of night where candles flicker too long and nothing good follows. The centerpiece of the meal was a stew, rich, fragrant, familiar, too familiar. Because Tantalus, in a gesture so horrifying it circles back around to stupid, had murdered his own son, Pelops, and cooked him. Diced, seasoned, plated with care. The ultimate test of divine wisdom. Would the gods notice? They did. Instantly. Except for Demeter. Grieving, distracted, still mourning Persephone's absence. She took a single bite before someone stopped her. The room fell into silence. And then the gods snapped. Pelops was restored, reassembled, reanimated, though legend says he was missing a shoulder, which Hephaestus replaced with ivory. But Tantalus? He was erased from Olympus, banished, stripped of favor, throne, and reputation, and sent to the underworld. There he was placed in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. Sounds pleasant until you learn the twist. He was starving. He was parched. But every time he reached down to drink, the water receded. Every time he stretched up to eat, the branches pulled away. He was surrounded by everything he craved, and could touch none of it. That was his punishment. Not fire, not chains, but eternal frustration. A hunger that never eased. A thirst that mocked him. And his name lived on, not in glory, but in the word tantalize. Because no one forgets the man who tried to serve his own son to the gods. And the gods never forgive a dinner guest who brings the wrong kind of dish. Chapter 38. Phaethon and the day everything went to hell. Phaethon wasn't trying to start the apocalypse. He just wanted to prove he had a dad. Not just any dad, of course. He claimed he was the son of Helios, the god who drove the sun across the sky in a blazing chariot every single day. Which, to be fair, is a bold claim for a teenager without a single sunbeam to show for it. The kids in town didn't believe him. Not really. They laughed behind his back, rolled their eyes to his face, and told him to get over himself. Gods didn't have kids with mortals, or at least, not kids like him. But Phaethon had his mother's word, and a boiling need to be right. So one morning, before the sun had even cleared the horizon, he left home and climbed. Not metaphorically. He literally climbed toward the edge of the world, where the gates of dawn were supposed to sit. And after more walking than any teenager has ever done without complaining, he found it. The Palace of the Sun. And inside, Helios. He was everything the story said. Tall, blinding, crowned in flame. The kind of presence that makes your knees consider folding without permission. And when Phaethon stood before him, too angry to be scared, too desperate to be humble, Helios paused, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "I'm your father." Phaethon didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He just stared, jaw tight. Then he said, "Let me drive the chariot." Helios laughed, not in a mean way, more in that, "Oh no, this is a terrible idea" kind of way. He explained, carefully, that it wasn't like riding a horse. The sun didn't just roll across the sky because someone tugged the reins. The chariot moved because he fought it into motion every day. The horses were fireborn and half feral. The sky was not built for tourists, but Phaethon wouldn't back down. So, against his better judgment, Helios gave in. He helped him into the chariot, gave him instructions: keep the middle course, don't rise too high, don't dip too low, hold the reins tight. Over and over, like a parent handing over the keys to a car that could vaporize continents. Then Phaethon was off. At first it was glorious. The sky lit up. The world stirred. People looked up and blinked into the light. not realizing something was already going very, very wrong, because Phaethon couldn't control it. The horses knew instantly that the hands on the reins weren't the same. They reared, swerved, climbed too high, and suddenly, snow fell in places that had never seen winter. Then, they dipped too low, scorching the earth, lighting forests and cities and oceans on fire. Entire regions turned to ash before breakfast. The world panicked. Prayers went out in every direction. And somewhere on Olympus, Zeus looked down, sighed deeply, and did what he always did when things got out of hand. He reached for a lightning bolt. It only took one. Phaethon never even saw it coming. He was too busy trying to pull the chariot back on course. Eyes wide, hands blistered, heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the sound of everything else breaking. The bolt hit him squarely. He felt like a comet. No wings, no grace. Just a boy tumbling out of the sky, flames trailing behind him, the earth waiting below. He crashed into the river Eridanus, his body gone, the fire finally out, and above, Helios sat in silence. The sun didn't rise the next day. It wasn't rebellion or punishment, it was grief. Chapter 39. Atalanta and the Race. She shouldn't have lost. Atalanta had no interest in marriage. She wasn't the type to sit around waiting to be chosen, and she certainly wasn't going to throw her life away just because a few old men in a temple thought women were supposed to do that. She was fast, faster than any man who had ever tried to outrun her, and there had been quite a few. She lived for the wild, for the freedom of moving without permission. She hunted with Artemis, brought down boars the size of carts, and wore her independence like armor. But this being ancient Greece, someone eventually had to try and marry her off. She didn't panic. She made a deal. She would marry, she said, but only to a man who could beat her in a foot race, lose, and he'd die. No questions, no second chances, just a sprint for your life. Dozens of suitors tried. Every one of them failed. They lined up, full of confidence and testosterone, and ended up staring at the sky as they bled into the dirt. Atalanta ran with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. She didn't look back. She didn't slow down. It was never even close. Then came Hippomenes. He was clever. Not particularly strong, not particularly fast, but clever enough to know that being clever was all he had. And luckily for him, Aphrodite had been watching. The goddess handed him 3 golden apples, shining, perfect, impossible to ignore. She's fast, Aphrodite said, but she's curious. Distract her. And so, on the morning of the race, Hippomenes lined up like the rest. He didn't try to psych her out or act like he had a chance. He just waited for the signal. They ran. Atalanta was already ahead when he dropped the first apple. She caught the glint of gold out of the corner of her eye and hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough to glance back. It happened again. And again. Each time the apple rolled just far enough off the path to make her wonder. Not panic. Not greed. Just wonder. And in a race where she was always just out of reach, that tiny hesitation was all he needed. Hippomenes crossed the finish line first. People cheered. Atalanta stood in silence, breath caught between fury and disbelief. She had lost. Not because he was faster, but because she had been distracted. She kept her word. They married. The crowd called it a love story. The gods called it entertainment. And for a while they were happy, or at least quiet. But of course this is Greece. The gods don't stay out of anything for long. One day, caught up in their own heat and arrogance, the couple decided to fool around in a temple. Not beside it. Not near it. Inside. On the altar, it was sacred to Cybele, a goddess not known for her patience. She transformed them both into lions, forever circling, side by side, but never again touching. Two creatures that would always remember being human. And maybe that was the point. Atalanta had tried to outrun fate, but in the end, it just changed shape. Chapter 39. Atalanta and the race she shouldn't have lost. Atalanta had no interest in marriage. She wasn't the type to sit around waiting to be chosen, and she certainly wasn't going to throw her life away just because a few old men in a temple thought women were supposed to do that. She was fast. Faster than any man who'd ever tried to outrun her. And there had been quite a few. She lived for the wild, for the freedom of moving without permission. She hunted with Artemis, brought down boars the size of carts, and wore her independence like armor. But, this being ancient Greece, someone eventually had to try and marry her off. She didn't panic. She made a deal. She would marry, she said, but only to a man who could beat her in a foot race. Lose, and he'd die. No questions, no second chances. Just a sprint for your life. Dozens of suitors tried. Every one of them failed. They lined up, full of confidence and testosterone, and ended up staring at the sky as they bled into the dirt. Atalanta ran with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. She didn't look back. She didn't slow down. It was never even close. Then came Hippomenes. He was clever. Not particularly strong, not particularly fast, but clever enough to know that being clever was all he had. And luckily for him, Aphrodite had been watching. The goddess handed him 3 golden apples. Shining, perfect, impossible to ignore. She's fast, Aphrodite said, but she's curious. Distract her. And so, on the morning of the race, Hippomenes lined up like the rest. He didn't try to psych her out or act like he had a chance. He just waited for the signal. They ran. Atalanta was already ahead when he dropped the first apple. She caught the glint of gold out of the corner of her eye and hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough to glance back. It happened again. And again. Each time, the apple rolled just far enough off the path to make her wonder. Not panic, not greed, just wonder. And in a race where she was always just out of reach, that tiny hesitation was all he needed. Hippomenes crossed the finish line first. People cheered. Atalanta stood in silence, breath caught between fury and disbelief. She had lost. Not because he was faster, but because she had been distracted. She kept her word. They married. The crowd called it a love story. The gods called it entertainment. And for a while, they were happy. Or at least quiet. But of course, this is Greece. The gods don't stay out of anything for long. One day, caught up in their own heat and arrogance, the couple decided to fool around in a temple. Not beside it, not near it, inside, on the altar. It was sacred to Cybele, a goddess not known for her patience. She transformed them both into lions, forever circling, side by side, but never again touching. 2 creatures that would always remember being human. And maybe that was the point. Atalanta had tried to outrun fate, but in the end, it just changed shape. Chapter 40. Orpheus, Eurydice, and the silence that followed. Orpheus was the kind of man whose music made people forget to breathe. He didn't just play the lyre. He poured his soul into every note. When he sang, trees leaned closer. Stones softened. Wild animals sat in quiet circles like children at story time. Even the gods paused to listen. There was something in his voice that reminded the world of everything it had ever lost. So when Eurydice died, the world felt it. She had been his wife, his center, his one still point in a chaotic life. There are different versions of how she died. A snake bite, a stumble, a cruel twist of fate. But all of them end the same way. Too soon. Too suddenly. Too wrong. Orpheus didn't scream. He didn't curse the sky. He picked up his lyre and walked into the underworld. No mortal had done that before. Not like this. He didn't bring a sword, didn't fight his way through demons or trick the gods. He played. He played so beautifully that the gates opened for him. Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell, sat down and listened. The rivers of the dead slowed to a gentle drift. Even the Furies wept into their hands. And when Orpheus stood before Hades and Persephone, he didn't beg. He just sang. A song of grief and memory. A song of hands that no longer touched and words that could no longer be spoken. A song that made the shadows flicker with something like warmth. The rulers of the dead looked at each other, and for once, they said yes. Eurydice could return, but only under one condition. She would follow Orpheus out of the underworld, step by step, through darkness and dust, through silence and stone. But he must not look back. Not even once. Not until they both stood in the world above. If he did, she would be lost. Forever. Orpheus agreed. He took the path upward, each footfall echoing too loudly. Behind him, there was no sound, no breath, no proof that she was really there. Still, he walked. But the journey was long. The underworld is not made for hope, and it presses on your spine the longer you stay. He could feel her presence behind him like the shadow of a dream, but he couldn't hear her, couldn't speak to her, couldn't look. And just as the first light of the living world appeared ahead, he hesitated. He stepped into the daylight, but the silence behind him was too much. He turned. For a heartbeat, he saw her, eyes wide, hands reaching, and then she vanished. No scream, no second chance, just air. Orpheus tried to follow, of course, tried to return, but the gates were closed, and this time his music could not move them. He wandered after that, not as a hero, not even as a man, just as an echo of what he had been, playing songs that made the stars pause, but never again, softened stone. Some say he died alone, torn apart by the maenads in a forest that no longer cared. Others say his music simply faded, and he followed it into the dark. But wherever he is now, he doesn't look back anymore. And that's the end of our little descent into myth, where gods misbehave, mortals suffer creatively, and nobody ever really learns their lesson. If your eyes are still open, it's probably just your body pretending it doesn't need sleep. Give it a minute. If this story helped you drift a little deeper into the dark, you can subscribe for more strange bedtime sagas. Like this video if the Greek gods didn't completely ruin your night, and drop a comment if there's a myth or mess you'd like to hear next. And if you want to support this chaos directly, you can do that over at ko-fi.com. No pressure, just gratitude, wrapped in stardust and sarcasm. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've just survived boring Greek mythology for sleep. Sleep well, and maybe don't accept golden fruit from strangers.